The wagon wheel hit a rut in the road just as Evelyn passed the painted sign that read Red Creek, established 1871, population 412. The jolt knocked a bundle of folded wool blankets sideways, and she had to grab for them with her free hand while keeping the rein steady with the other. The horse, an aging bay gelding named Casper, didn't so much as twitch his ears. "Easy," she murmured to him, though he hadn't needed the reassurance. She was the one who needed it. The main street of Red Creek was wider than she'd expected. 2 rows of timber and brick storefronts faced each other across a long stretch of frozen mud, the kind of mud that doesn't give under your boot so much as swallow it. There was a hotel with a sign hanging crooked in the wind, a general store with barrels out front, a sheriff's office, and at the far end, a saloon that looked like it had seen considerably more action than any of the other buildings combined. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog picked its way across the road with the cautious dignity of an animal who'd been stepped on before and didn't intend to let it happen again. Evelyn pulled Casper to a stop in front of the general store. She sat there for a moment with the reins across her lap, taking inventory. 2 men on the boardwalk had turned to look at her. A woman carrying a basket of bread from somewhere had paused mid-stride. The boy she'd noticed earlier, maybe 9 years old, red-cheeked, in a coat 2 sizes too big, stood on a wooden step and stared at her with the unblinking frankness only children manage. She climbed down from the wagon seat. Her boots hit the frozen ground with a crunch. She was a tall woman, broader in the shoulder than fashion liked, with thick dark hair pinned under a felt hat, and a coat she'd sewn herself from heavyweight wool. Her hands were rough. Her face wasn't what you'd call delicate. She had the kind of features that took a minute to read: strong jaw, serious eyes, a mouth that didn't smile reflexively the way women in towns usually learn to do. She straightened her coat, reached into the wagon for a sample bundle, and walked toward the door of Hendrick's General Store. The bell above the door announced her. Inside it smelled like wood smoke, dried tobacco, and flour. There were shelves running floor to ceiling along the back wall, a worn counter, and a heavy-set man in a canvas apron standing behind it with his arms crossed in a way that wasn't exactly welcoming and wasn't exactly hostile, but landed somewhere in between that Evelyn had learned to read as prove yourself fast. "Afternoon," she said. "Help you?" the man said. He was looking at her the way people look at something they're not sure is for sale or for trouble. "I'm Evelyn Hart. I came up from Pratt County with a wagon of winter goods, blankets, coats, lined vests, work gloves, quality wool, heavy weave. I was hoping to speak with you about carrying some of them in your store, or at least letting me sell from outside your door for a few days." She set the sample bundle on the counter and unfolded it. A blanket, thick and even, in a dark green and gray pattern, the stitching tight and clean. The man, Hendricks, she'd find out later, looked at the blanket. He looked at her. He picked up one corner, rubbed it between his fingers, set it back down. "We don't carry women's goods," he said. Evelyn blinked. "These aren't women's goods. They're winter goods, blankets, work gloves." She unfolded the gloves next to the blanket. Heavy leather palm, lined inside with wool she'd carded herself. Men's sizes, built for outdoor work. "We've got blankets." "May I see them?" Something moved across his face. Not quite a fence, but close to it. He turned, pulled a folded blanket from a shelf, and put it on the counter. Evelyn looked at it without picking it up. It was thinner than her index finger, woven loose, the kind of blanket that might keep you warm in October, but would fail you fast in January. She didn't say any of that. "I can offer you better quality at a comparable price," she said. "If your customers are spending a winter in Red Creek, they're going to need something heavier than that." "My customers," Hendricks said, "have been buying from me for 7 years." "I understand that." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking to replace anything you carry. I'm asking for a chance to show what I make." Hendricks looked at her again with that same flat reading expression. Then he folded his arms. "We're not interested," he said. "But thank you." It wasn't thank you. It was a door closing. Thud. She tried 3 more merchants that afternoon. The woman who ran the dry goods shop, a Mrs. Pendleton, thin and precise in her movements, had said she didn't have room for new inventory without ever looking up from her accounting ledger. The man who ran the hotel supply had told her, very politely, that he ordered direct from a supplier in Topeka and wasn't in the habit of buying from traveling sellers. The fourth man, who ran a small outfitter's shop at the north end of the street, had looked her over from hat to boot and said, "You sew all this yourself?" "Sir, well, I may see." "Yes," she said. "Huh." He'd rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, that's something." He hadn't bought anything either. Evelyn walked back to her wagon and stood beside Casper for a moment, her hand on his neck, not stroking him so much as just resting there. The cold had settled in hard. The sky above Red Creek had gone the flat white color it gets when snow is thinking about coming. She pulled a piece of paper from her coat pocket. It was a letter, 2 weeks old, from her cousin in Abilene, who'd said Red Creek was growing fast and winter goods were scarce. She read it again. She folded it and put it back. She'd sold half her inventory before ever reaching Red Creek, stopped at small homesteads and farms along the way, sold to ranch wives and hired hands who'd pressed her hands, and told her the blankets were the best they'd seen outside of Wichita. That money was enough to keep her going for another 3 weeks if she was careful. She had $62.40. She had Casper and the wagon and about 400 pounds of goods she needed to sell before the weather turned. She did not have the option of failing. She sold her first Red Creek goods that evening at the edge of town. A group of ranch hands had ridden in just before dusk, loud and rough-edged, spilling out of their saddles in front of the saloon. One of them spotted her wagon and wandered over with the particular lack of purpose that meant he was curious but didn't want to admit it. He was maybe 25 with a sun-chapped face and a hat that had seen a lot of weather. "What are you selling?" he asked. "Blankets, coats, gloves." He looked at the wagon. "How much for a pair of gloves?" "Depends on the size." She pulled out her sample box. "What size are your hands?" He held one up, large, wide across the palm, the knuckles cracked from cold. She pulled a pair and handed them over. He pulled one on, flexed his fingers, pulled it off. "How much?" 80 cents. He was quiet for a second. "That's steep." "Feel the lining." He did. Something shifted in his expression. "All right." He dug in his vest pocket. His friends had drifted over by then. 3 more men who'd been watching from the saloon door. They looked at her the way groups of men look at a woman alone with a wagon. Not all of it hostile, but not all of it comfortable either. "What else you got?" one of them called. "Coats," she said. "Blankets, vests. Tell me what you need." She sold 2 pairs of gloves and a lined vest before the cold drove them all inside. It wasn't much. It was enough to matter. She made her camp that night on the edge of town where the land opened up a little and a stand of cottonwoods gave some windbreak. She'd done this before, made camp alone on the road, cooked over a small fire, slept in the back of the wagon under a pile of her own goods. She was good at the practical pieces of it. The fire, the food, the keeping warm. It was the silence she hadn't entirely worked out how to get along with. She lay in the back of the wagon, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood branches, and thought about her father's ranch in Pratt County, the house they'd built, the barn, the pasture where she'd learned to walk, where she'd broken her wrist falling off a fence at age 7, where she'd stood at 19 with her father watching the first real herd come in and thought, "This is what a good life looks like." The bank had taken it in March, not because her father did anything wrong, because the man who held the note on the loan had decided he wanted the land and found a way to make the numbers say something they didn't say. By the time they understood what had happened, it was too late to fight it in any way that mattered. Her father had died 4 months later, not dramatically, just quietly, the way men do when the thing they built their whole life around gets pulled out from under them and they don't have the energy to rebuild. Her mother had gone to live with her sister in Missouri. Her brother had gone west, and Evelyn had taken the sewing machine, the wool she'd already bought, and a wagon she'd traded her mother's silver for, and she'd started over. That had been 14 months ago. She pulled a blanket tighter around herself and stared at the canvas overhead. "You don't have to like this town," she told herself. "You just have to sell here long enough to move on." Morning came hard and gray. She was at it by 7, setting up a simple display off the back of the wagon near the feed store, where traffic was heaviest in the early hours. She'd laid out the blankets over the wagon's back gate, hung 2 coats from a board she'd propped up with the tailgate strut, and laid the gloves out in neat pairs. The first hour was slow. People walked past. Some glanced. Some looked deliberately away in the particular way of people who don't want to be approached. One woman stopped, touched a blanket, and said, "Oh, these are lovely," with genuine warmth, and then said, "I couldn't today," and walked on. The trouble started around mid-morning. 3 men rode past slowly, not stopping, just looking. The one in front was heavy-set, maybe 50, with a well-cut coat and the kind of horse that costs more than most men earned in a year. He had a thick gray mustache and small, flat eyes. He looked at her wagon the way you look at something that doesn't belong where it is. He didn't stop. He rode on. But 10 minutes later, one of his men, she'd figure out the connection later, stopped his horse directly in front of her display and let the animal shift sideways so its flank knocked into the board holding her coats. The coats fell. The board clattered into the mud. "Sorry about that," the man said, in a voice that meant the opposite. Evelyn picked up the board. She picked up the coats. She didn't say anything. The man watched her. He had a mean stillness about him, the kind that isn't hot-headed but deliberate. "Awful lot of work," he said, "for someone who's going to be gone inside a week." She shook the mud off the second coat and rehung it. "I suppose we'll see," she said. He looked at her for another moment, like he was deciding whether she was worth more of his time. He clicked his horse forward and rode on. Evelyn stood there and breathed slowly for a count of 5. Her hands were very steady. She'd learned that from her father, how to go still when you wanted to shake. She sold a blanket 40 minutes later to a farm wife who'd seen what happened and walked over with a particular set to her jaw that said she'd made a decision. "How much for that green one?" the woman asked. $1.25. "I'll take it." She counted out the coins and looked at Evelyn. "Don't let them run you off. Half the meanness in this town belongs to one man, and the rest of us are tired of it." Evelyn looked at her. "Who's the man?" "Victor Hale." The woman tucked the blanket under her arm. "He owns about 1/3 of this county and wants the other 2/3. You'll know him when you see him." She walked off. Evelyn thought about the man with the gray mustache on the expensive horse. She thought she'd already seen him. The afternoon brought a different kind of attention. A group of young cowboys, 3 of them, fresh off a cattle drive and full of the energy men have when they've been cooped up on the trail too long, stopped in front of her wagon with the expressed intention of being funny. "You make all this yourself?" the first one asked, holding up a glove by 2 fingers like it was a dead animal. "I did," she said. "You got a man helping you?" "No." "Huh." He tossed the glove back. It landed half off the display. "You ever think maybe that's the problem?" His friends laughed. Evelyn picked up the glove and smoothed it. "The problem with what?" she asked. He blinked. Hadn't expected the question. With you being here selling things. Women got stores for a reason. They don't usually go around." He gestured vaguely at the wagon. "Setting up businesses?" she offered. "Wandering," he said more firmly. "I'm not wandering. I know exactly where I am." She looked at him. "Do you need winter gloves or not?" His friends were grinning now, but it had shifted. Not laughing at her exactly, more like they weren't sure what they'd walked into. "Maybe," said the first one, more carefully. "Then let me show you what I have. If you don't like them, no harm done." She set out 3 pairs in different sizes. "These are lined with wool I carded myself, double-stitched palm. You can work in them without losing the feel of the reins." The man closest to her picked up a pair, examined them, pulled one on. He made a fist, flexed his fingers. He looked at his friend. Something passed between them. "How much?" he asked. She sold all 3 of them gloves. The first one, the one who'd made the comment about wandering, bought a vest too after she held it up and told him flat out that it would hold up better than what he was wearing, which she could see was already wearing through at the shoulders. He didn't apologize for what he'd said. She didn't need him to. She needed the $1.65 bet. She'd been in Red Creek 4 days when she met Gideon Cross. She'd heard the name by then. You couldn't spend 4 days in a town of 400 without picking up its essential geography. Who owned what? Who mattered to whom? Where the power sat. Gideon Cross owned the Cross Creek Ranch about 6 miles east of town, one of the oldest spreads in the county. He ran cattle and horses, employed 15 hands year-round, and had the reputation of being a fair man. which in frontier Kansas was either the highest praise or a kind of insult, depending on who was saying it. She met him on a Tuesday morning in the mud between Hendrick's General Store and the feed depot. He was carrying a heavy crate out of the feed store, and she was coming around the back of her wagon, and they nearly walked into each other. He stopped. She stopped. He was a lean man, mid-40s, with a weathered face and gray at his temples and the kind of posture that comes from years of physical work. Straight, but not stiff. "Ma'am," he said, and stepped to the side. "Thank you," she said, and stepped to the other side. And for a moment they mirrored each other, which under other circumstances might have been funny. He set the crate down on the step and wiped his hands on his coat. "You're the woman selling out of the wagon," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn Hart. Gideon Cross. He shook her hand, which not everyone had been doing. "I heard about you." Good things or bad? He seemed to weigh that honestly. Depends who you're asking. Bert Calloway runs the outfitter's shop at the North End. Said you were pushy. Mrs. Farrell over at the church auxiliary said your blankets were the finest she'd touched in 10 years. I'll take that. I'd lean toward Mrs. Farrell's judgment myself. He looked at the wagon. May I? She led him to the back and showed him the inventory. He went through it methodically, felt the weight of the blankets, examined the stitching on the coats, asked about the materials and where she sourced her wool. He handled things with the directness of a man who was used to evaluating practical objects and didn't see the point in being indirect about it. I've got 15 men wintering at the ranch, he said. They came through last season without adequate gear, and I lost 2 weeks of work to frostbite injuries. I'm not letting that happen again. He looked at her. What would it cost me to outfit them? Blankets, gloves, vests, 15 sets. Evelyn didn't let the number show on her face. She did the calculation in her head. Give me a minute, she said, and pulled out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and worked through it in pencil while he waited. She gave him a number. He looked at it. That's fair, he said. I can also make to order if any of your men have specific sizing needs. I'll need measurements. Some of them are odd sizes, he admitted. Big Swede, that's what they call him. His real name's Lars. He's about 6'4" and built like a barn door. Nothing off the shelf fits him right. Bring him to me or send his measurements. I can have something made in 4 days. Gideon Cross looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. You know, he said, I came into town today expecting to order from the catalog out of Kansas City. It was going to take 6 weeks to arrive. He picked up a glove. These are better than what I'd have gotten from the catalog. I know, she said. He almost smiled. You don't lack for confidence. I lack for a lot of things, she said, but not that. He didn't pay her in full on the spot. He paid half, which was standard, and said he'd have the rest when she delivered. She'd have preferred the full amount, but accepted the half because it was more than she'd made in 4 days combined, and because she trusted something in the way he'd handled the blankets, like a man who meant to pay for what he bought. The transaction changed the texture of her days in Red Creek. She didn't understand it immediately. But in a small town, who you're seen talking to matters more than almost anything else you do. People had seen her in front of the feed store talking to Gideon Cross for 20 minutes. They'd seen him go through her goods and hand her money. By afternoon, it had worked its way into the social fabric of the town, the way everything does in a place that size. And when she set up her display the next morning, there were 2 women waiting to look before she'd even finished laying things out. Word, she was learning, was its own kind of currency. She worked every hour of it. She set up earlier, stayed later. When it was too cold to stand in the street, she sat in the wagon with her hands under a blanket and sewed repair work on things that needed it. She kept a small price list and a notebook and wrote down every transaction, every name she learned, every complaint and preference. The farm wife who wanted something in a darker color. The man who needed a right-handed glove a size larger than the left. The family with 4 children and not enough wool for the winter. She was learning the town's needs the way you learn any landscape, by being in it long enough that the features start to make sense. And she was learning something else. Victor Hale's name came up everywhere. Not always directly. Sometimes it was oblique, the way people talk around something they're afraid of. The cattle baron on the East Road. The man who controls the grazing permits. The situation with the Henderson property. You know how these things go. She started to piece it together. The Henderson property was a parcel of land that had been part of a small ranching family's holdings until 2 years ago, when the family had been forced to sell under circumstances that several people described in ways that didn't quite add up. A debt that appeared to have doubled, a legal notice served at an inconvenient time, a sheriff who'd seemed to arrive faster than the distance made sense. The land had ended up in Victor Hale's hands. The Henderson family had left the county. There was another story about a grazing permit that had been revoked from a small operation east of town, shortly after the owner refused to sell land Hale wanted. And a third story, more vague, about a local councilman who'd changed his vote on something, nobody would say quite what, and then had done very well financially in the following year. These were the kinds of stories that lived in the corners of conversations, half told, finished with a shrug and a look that said, "What can you do?" Evelyn had heard these stories before. Different names, different county, same architecture. She knew what it looked like when someone was building an empire out of other people's losses. On Friday afternoon, 8 days into her time in Red Creek, she was packing up her display as the light failed when she heard footsteps that were too deliberate to be accidental. She turned. Victor Hale stood 6 feet away, alone, which was unusual because in the time she'd been in Red Creek, she'd never seen him without at least one man nearby. He was shorter than she'd have guessed from a distance, thick through the chest, with small hands and that flat gray mustache. He dressed well, fine wool coat, good boots, a hat that cost what some men earned in a month. "Miss Hart," he said. She straightened. "Mr. Hale." He looked at her wagon with the mild, examining expression of a man who owns enough that other people's property registers to him as scenery. "You're still here," he said. "I am." "Most traveling sellers move on after 4 or 5 days." He tilted his head. "Red Creek's a small market, hard to sustain. I found it sustaining enough." "You found Gideon Cross," he said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at him, let the silence sit for a moment. "Were you looking to buy something, Mr. Hale, or looking for something else?" His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of tell. "I'm looking to be helpful," he said. "This is a hard town for a woman alone. I'd hate to see you invest more time here than the market can return." He paused. "There's good selling to be done in Dodge City, or Wichita, bigger market, more buyers." "That's kind of you," she said, "but I'll sort that out myself." He looked at her for a beat too long. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a recalibration. "You're a determined woman," he said. "I've been told that." "In my experience," he said, "determined women in frontier towns either find a way through or find they've exhausted themselves for nothing." He said it pleasantly, the way you'd say something you wanted to sound like advice but meant as a warning. "I hope it's the former for you." He touched his hat brim and walked away. Evelyn watched him go. Her hands, at her sides, were completely still. She wasn't afraid of him. She was something more useful than afraid. She was paying attention. That night she sat at her small fire and thought about what she knew. Hale had come to see her himself. Not sent a man, not arranged for another incident with a horse and a knocked-over display. Come himself in the evening, away from witnesses, with that pleasant voice and those careful words about Dodge City and Wichita. He wanted her gone. More specifically, and this was the part she kept turning over, he wanted her gone from Gideon Cross's orbit. He hadn't mentioned the town or her selling. He'd mentioned Gideon by name. She thought about the things she'd heard. The Henderson property, the grazing permits, the councilman. She thought about the land she'd lost, the land her family had lost, and the man who'd held their note and decided he wanted it. She thought about what her father had said, near the end, when she'd asked him why he hadn't fought harder at the time. He'd looked at her with the tiredness that had settled into him by then and said, "We didn't understand what we were looking at until it was too late." That's how these men work, Evie. They make you think it's your bad luck until the moment you realize it was their plan. The fire cracked. Casper shifted in his sleep. Evelyn pulled her notebook from her pocket and started writing down everything she'd heard about Victor Hale, from the beginning, in the order she'd heard it. The Henderson family, the grazing permits, the councilman, the man who'd knocked her display over and said she'd be gone inside a week, the visit this evening with its careful pleasantness. It wasn't a plan yet. It wasn't even evidence. It was just a picture she was starting to see the outlines of. She'd learned from her father's mistake. She wasn't going to wait until it was too late to understand what she was looking at. She delivered the Cross Creek Ranch order the following Monday. She drove out herself, Casper managing the 6 miles in good time, the wagon loaded with the 15 sets of winter gear and the 2 special order pieces she'd made for Lars, the big Swede, whom she'd measured during a brief, awkward encounter at the feed store, where he'd stood very still with his arms out like a man being fitted for a suit for the first time, and had turned bright red the entire time. Gideon met her at the ranch gate. The place was smaller than she'd imagined from the name, not in a disappointing way, but in the way of something real rather than grand. The main house was solid timber and stone, low and long. The barn was bigger than the house, which was the proper frontier priority. 3 hands were working near a corral where a horse was being shod. Smoke came from the main house chimney. He helped her unload, which she hadn't asked for but accepted. She met some of the hands, a taciturn man named Abe, who examined his new gloves like they were small animals he wasn't sure about, a young Mexican hand named Tomas, who said gracias in a way that sounded like he meant it, and Lars, who held his new coat up and then put it on and stood there with the look of a man who couldn't remember the last time something fit correctly. "Good?" Evelyn asked him. He nodded. He was a man of few words, but he wore the coat to the barn and didn't take it off, which was its own kind of review. After, Gideon paid her the remaining balance, and they stood in the yard with the cold pressing in and the sky starting to look like snow again. "You built something in Red Creek in 10 days, he said. "That's harder than it looks from the outside." "I haven't built anything yet," she said. "I've just survived long enough to maybe build something." "Victor Hale came to see you," he said. Not a question. She looked at him. "He did? What did he say?" "That Wichita was a better market." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the ridge line to the west where the clouds were building. "He said that to the Hendersons too," he said, before he found a way to make them sell. She waited. "He wants my grazing land," Gideon said. "East pasture, about 400 acres that runs up against the creek. The grass there is better than anything else in the county. He's been after it for 3 years. He turned from the ridge to look at her. "I haven't been able to prove anything, but the grazing permit for my south field got held up twice in the last year without any clear reason, and I had a hand file a complaint against me last summer. Turned out to be completely false, but it cost me 2 weeks dealing with it." "A pattern," she said. "A pattern," he agreed, "but not anything a judge would call evidence." She thought about what she'd written in her notebook. "Do you know what he has on the councilman?" Gideon looked at her steadily. "You've been listening?" "It's what I do. I sit in the cold and wait for people to buy things, and I listen." She met his eyes. "The councilman changed a vote, and then his finances improved. That's a thread. That's a thread you could pull and find nothing at the end of it. Or you could pull it and find something that gets you into a great deal of trouble." He said it without heat, just plainly, the way he'd evaluated her goods. "Hale has money, and lawyers, and 20 years of knowing where everybody in this county is buried, figuratively speaking. I know what that kind of man looks like," she said. "I've seen what happens when you let him keep going." She hadn't meant to say that much, but it was said. Gideon looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who understood that your words were standing in for a larger story. "You staying in Red Creek?" he asked. "Appears that way," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then come back Thursday. I want to show you something." He didn't say what. He turned toward the barn, then stopped. "And Evelyn, watch your wagon. Not every accident in this town is an accident." She drove back to Red Creek with the wind picking up behind her and Casper's breath making small clouds in the air. She thought about what Gideon had said, about patterns and evidence, about men like Hale and the 20 years of ground he'd built under himself, about the councilman's vote and the Henderson family's debt and the grazing permits that got delayed without explanation. She thought about her father's ledgers, which she'd gone through after his death, and found a discrepancy, a payment her father had clearly made, marked in his handwriting, that didn't appear in the bank's records. She'd brought it to a lawyer who'd said it would be very difficult to prove, and expensive, and the case against them was closed anyway. That's how these men work. The trick wasn't to wait until you had perfect evidence. The trick was to start pulling threads before you were too weak to hold them. She pulled into Red Creek as the first flurries of snow began to drift down. Not a storm, just the sky reminding you what was coming. She parked the wagon, checked Casper's water and feed, and sat in the dim back of the wagon with her notebook open on her knee. She wrote down what Gideon had told her. Grazing permit delays. False complaint by a ranch hand. East pasture 400 acres. Creek access. She wrote, Councilman? What was the vote? What changed? She wrote, Henderson family. Where are they now? She wrote, Hale's lawyers. Who? Local? None of it amounted to anything yet, but it was a map of a territory she was going to need to understand. Outside, Red Creek was settling into its evening rhythms. The saloon was warming up. The hotel had a lamp in every window. Smoke rose straight up into the cold, still air above the chimneys. The town had tried to run her off 3 times in 11 days. She was still here. She closed the notebook and tucked it back in her coat and lay down in the back of the wagon with a blanket pulled up and her mind working through the pieces of what she knew. It wasn't much yet. It wasn't nothing. The snow was coming. The real snow. The kind that would change everything in this part of Kansas. She could feel it in the particular way the cold had gone quiet, like the land was holding its breath. When it came, she'd be here. She'd made sure of that. Thursday came with a sky the color of old pewter, and a wind that found every gap in your coat, no matter how well it was sewn. Evelyn drove out to Cross Creek Ranch with her notebook in her pocket and a second layer of wool under her outer coat. She'd spent the 2 days between in Red Creek doing what she did, selling, listening, watching. She'd made a point of going back to the general store to speak with Hendricks again, not to sell him anything but to buy a small tin of boot wax and a length of cord she didn't particularly need. Paying customers got treated differently than sellers, and she'd wanted to stand on that side of the counter and see what she could hear. She'd heard enough. 2 men near the back of the store had been talking about a parcel on the South Road, something about a fence line in a survey that had come back differently than the original homestead plat. One of them had said, well, what can you do? Which she was beginning to understand was Red Creek's unofficial motto. The other had said Hale's man came out about the fence, said it crossed onto Hale's property now, and then they'd noticed her, and the conversation had folded up like a letter being put back in an envelope. She'd paid for her cord and boot wax and left. Now, on the road to Cross Creek, she turned the pieces over in her mind. Fence line disputes, survey adjustments, permits delayed, complaints filed and dropped, each one small enough to be explained away, each one, assembled, pointing the same direction. The ranch came into view through a stand of bare cottonwoods, the barn roof white with frost. Gideon was waiting near the corral, talking to Abe, who listened with his arms crossed and then walked toward the barn without looking up when Evelyn's wagon pulled in. He's like that with everyone, Gideon said, coming to take Casper's lead. Don't read into it. I didn't, she said, which was mostly true. He tied the horse and led her not toward the house, but toward a small outbuilding to the east side of the barn, a structure she hadn't paid much attention to on Monday, which she now saw was more solidly built than it looked from the outside. Stone foundation, timber frame, small iron stove in the corner. He'd put a lamp on the shelf and laid a ledger and a stack of folded papers on the work table. This is what I wanted to show you, he said. She came to the table and looked. The papers were land surveys. Not one, 6 of them, different dates going back 8 years, all covering the same general area in the East County between Red Creek and the creek itself. She spread them out without touching them first, reading the dates. This is your property, she said. Parts of it, he pointed. This line here, the eastern boundary of my east pasture, it's moved. In the original survey from 1872, it runs about 40 yards east of Hale Creek. He put his finger on the second paper. By 1877, it's been redrawn 30 yards west of the creek. Someone moved a survey line. Someone filed an amended survey with the county land office. I found out when I went to renew my grazing permit last year, and the clerk pulled the current survey to check my acreage. It didn't match what I had. He picked up a third paper. The amended survey was filed by a land office surveyor named Croft. I went looking for Croft. He retired in '78 and moved to Colorado. Convenient, she said. I thought so too. He set the papers down. There's no record of what prompted the amended survey. No correspondence, no complaint from an adjacent landowner, no court order. It just appeared. Evelyn looked at the papers. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a surveyor. But she'd been raised on a ranch, and she'd sat across a table from bankmen and county clerks enough times in the last year to have a working understanding of what documents could do when someone needed them to do something specific. If the county accepted the amended survey as the official record, she said, that's your legal boundary line now. Which means, he said, about 60 acres of my east pasture technically belongs to an entity called Hale Land Holdings. He said it evenly, but there was something underneath it. Not anger so much as the exhaustion of a man who'd been sitting with this knowledge and no clean way out of it. Does Hale know you know? I'd guess yes. My lawyer in Hayes City has been back and forth with his people for 7 months. Very polite letters going nowhere. He pulled out the lamp from the shelf and set it closer to the papers. What I don't have is proof of who ordered the amendment or why Croft filed it without a triggering complaint. Without that, it's just a surveying error that could have been made by anyone for any reason. Evelyn pulled her notebook from her coat. Can I write these dates down? He gestured at the papers. Write down whatever you need. She worked through them methodically. Dates, surveyor names, filing references, the acreage numbers. Her handwriting was small and precise, the product of years of careful record-keeping in ledgers where every inch counted. The Henderson family, she said while she wrote. What happened to their land? Gideon leaned against the wall. John Henderson had 120 acres on the East Road. Good land, decent water access. He'd been there since '74. About 3 years ago, a note he'd taken out on his barn improvement went into dispute. The lender, a man named Pryor, who's since moved on, claimed Henderson had missed payments. Henderson said he hadn't and had receipts. By the time the legal process finished, Pryor had sold the note to a property trust, and the trust, which I eventually traced to Hale Land Holdings, foreclosed. Henderson had receipts, she said. He did. And they weren't accepted. The judge ruled the receipts were incomplete. 1 month was missing. She looked up from the notebook. The month the payment would have cleared the principal. Gideon looked at her. Yes. She wrote that down. Henderson, missing receipt. Critical month. Where are the Hendersons now? Wife's people are in Missouri. John is... I heard he's doing day labor somewhere in the territory. He left before the foreclosure finished. Couldn't stand to watch it. He paused. He had 3 boys. All of them grew up on that land. Evelyn wrote that down too, though she wasn't sure what she'd do with it yet. Some things you write down not because they're evidence, but because they're the weight of what you're carrying. She closed the notebook. What does your lawyer in Hayes City say about the survey? She asked. He says the standard for overturning a filed survey is very high. He says we'd need either a sworn statement from Croft or evidence that the amendment was filed in exchange for something. Payment, a favor, coercion. Without one of those, we're arguing against an official document. So you need to find Croft, or find what he was paid, or find something else I haven't thought of yet. He said it without self-pity. Just practically the way you account for a problem that doesn't have a solution visible yet. Evelyn stood looking at the surveys laid out on the table. She thought about her father's ledgers, about the payment that appeared in his handwriting and not in the bank's records, about the way these things worked, not through dramatic forgery or obvious crime, but through the careful manipulation of paperwork, the strategic absence of a document, the amendment filed quietly with a clerk who may or may not have understood what he was processing. What happened to the Croft survey originals? She asked. The ones before the amendment. In my files. The county has only the amended version. What about adjacent landowners? Anyone who would have been present when the original boundary was established? Gideon thought for a moment. Old man Pruitt. He homesteaded the parcel north of my east pasture back in the late 60s. He was there when the first survey was run. He'd know where the line sat. Is he still in the county? Lives about 4 miles north. He's 80-something, sharp, but he doesn't leave his place much in the winter. Would he talk? Pruitt? Gideon considered it. He doesn't have much use for Hale. Lost water access on his lower pasture after one of Hale's ditch projects diverted the creek flow a few years back. Never got compensated. He straightened. He'd talk to me. I'm not sure he'd talk to a stranger. Then take me to him, Evelyn said. Gideon looked at her for a beat. You sure you want to be more involved in this? She met his eyes. I've been involved in this since the day Hale's man knocked my display into the mud and told me I'd be gone inside a week. I'd rather be involved on purpose than by accident. They went to Prewitt's place the following Saturday in Gideon's wagon. The old man met them at the gate with a rifle under his arm, in the loose, habitual way of someone who carries a weapon the way other people carry a walking stick. Not because he expected to use it, but because 50 years on the frontier had made it a reflex. He was a small, weathered man with a white beard trimmed close and eyes the color of creek water in winter, gray-green, clear, missing nothing. "Cross," he said. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Who's this?" "Evelyn Hart. She's got an interest in the same questions I've been asking." Prewitt looked at her for a long moment. "You the woman selling out of the wagon in town?" "Yes." "Mrs. Farrell bought one of your blankets, said it was good work." He shifted the rifle. "Come in, then." The house was small and absolutely clean in the way bachelor frontier houses rarely were. Everything in its place, the floor swept, the shelves organized. He had books. More than you'd expect. She noticed a surveying manual among them. He gave them coffee from a pot that had been on the stove a while and sat across from them at the kitchen table. "The East Pasture Line," he said, before Gideon had spoken. "You're asking about the Croft Amendment." "You know about it," Gideon said. "I know everything that happens within 5 miles of this property." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "I was present when the original survey was run in 72. I signed as a witness. The eastern boundary of your east pasture was established at 42 yards east of the creek center line." He said it with the flat precision of a man recalling a number he'd never forgotten because it had always mattered. "The amended survey moved that line to 18 yards west of the center line." "That's 60 yards total," Evelyn said. 61. "I measured it myself after I found out." He looked at his coffee. "I heard about the Croft Amendment about 2 years after it was filed. Went into town to ask about it, and the county clerk, different man than the one who filed it, the filing clerk retired, couldn't tell me what had prompted it." His jaw set. "I wrote a letter to the state land office in Topeka. Never got a response worth the paper it was printed on." "Would you make a sworn statement?" Evelyn asked. Both men looked at her. "About what you witnessed in 72, she said. "That the boundary was placed at 42 yards east of the creek center line, and that you personally measured the discrepancy after the amendment." Prewitt looked at her steadily. "That's a legal document." "Yes." "You know what it means to put your name on a legal document against Victor Hale in this county." "I know what it means not to," she said. That sat in the room for a moment. The stove ticked. Prewitt set his cup down. He looked at Gideon. "Is she always like this?" "I've only known her 2 weeks," Gideon said. "But so far, yes." Something moved at the corner of Prewitt's mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been sitting on this for 2 years," he said, waiting for someone to ask the right question. He turned back to Evelyn. "I'll give you your statement. I want it written fair and clean so it holds up. And I want a copy for myself." "I'll write it myself," she said. "You can correct every word." They drove back to Red Creek in the late afternoon with the wind coming hard from the northwest and the sky making its slow, serious turn toward what was coming. Evelyn could feel it in her back teeth, the particular atmospheric pressure of a major storm building somewhere to the west. She'd grown up in Kansas. She knew that feeling. "He'll talk to Hale's people," she said. Not an accusation, just the reality of small counties and interlocked networks. "Probably," Gideon agreed. "Or someone who saw us at his gate will mention it." "Does that change anything?" He drove for a moment without answering, which she was learning meant he was thinking rather than avoiding. "It accelerates things," he said finally. "If Hale knows we're pulling on that thread, he won't wait to see what unravels. He'll move first." "What does moving first look like?" "He files a legal claim on the 60 acres before we can challenge the survey. That gets us into a court fight that'll take 2 years and cost more than the land is worth to most people." He paused. "Or he finds another way to pressure me. The grazing permit, a complaint against one of my hands, something to keep me too busy fighting fires to focus on the survey. He's good at that," she said, "keeping people busy." "Very good." She thought about the notebook in her pocket, about what she'd been assembling, threads that individually could be dismissed but together described something specific and intentional, She thought about the lawyer in Hayes City who wrote polite letters and received polite letters back. "Your lawyer," she said. "Is he the right lawyer for this?" Gideon glanced at her. "What do you mean? Is he someone who fights or someone who corresponds?" A beat of silence. "He's thorough," Gideon said, which answered the question without quite saying it. "You need someone who fights," she said. "If Hale's going to move, you need someone in front of a judge who makes things uncomfortable for him. Correspondence won't do it. Lawyers who fight cost more than lawyers who correspond." "I know." She looked at the road ahead. "I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's what it is." He didn't respond to that, but she saw him work his jaw in the way that meant he was turning something over. They reached Red Creek as the lamplights were coming on in the storefronts, the town assembling its evening face. Gideon stopped in front of the feed store where she'd left her wagon. "I'll ask around about a different lawyer," he said. "I know a man in Abilene who's got a harder reputation." "Good." He held the reins and looked at her in the failing light. "You understand you're making an enemy here. Whatever footing you'd built with Hale, whatever chance he might leave you alone." "He was never going to leave me alone," she said. "I figured that out on the night he came to my wagon and told me about Wichita." She climbed down, retrieved her footing, looked back up at him. "And I don't want to be left alone. I want him stopped." Gideon looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Thursday," he said finally. "Come back Thursday, and be careful on the road." But she was careful. She moved her camp from the cottonwood stand to the south edge of town, closer to the livery where there was more traffic and more light. She started packing her display away earlier in the evenings. She paid attention to who walked past twice. She also kept working. This was the thing nobody who tried to intimidate people understood, or maybe they understood it and that's why they did it. The goal was to make you too scared and tired to do anything but manage the threat. The goal was to take your attention off your work and put it on your survival instead. Evelyn refused to let that happen. She got up at 6 and worked until the cold drove her in, and then worked by lamplight in the back of the wagon, cutting and stitching while the wind moved around the canvas. She sold every day. She kept her books, kept her notebook, kept both kinds of records separate and exact. And she talked to people, not about Hale, not directly. She'd learned enough to know that frontal approaches in small towns produced frontal resistance. Instead, she asked questions that sounded like idle interest. Where a family had moved when they sold their property, who'd served on the county council in '77, what the water situation had been like before the ditch project on the East Creek. She asked these things while fitting a woman for a coat, while counting change for a pair of gloves, while sharing a piece of bread with the woman who ran the boarding house, who had the particular gift of people in that profession. She'd heard everything and remembered most of it. The boarding house woman was named Clara Webb. She was 53 and built solidly and had run the boarding house alone since her husband walked in front of a horse cart 8 years ago. She was not a gossip. She was something more precise than a gossip. She was an archivist. "The councilman you're asking about," Clara said one afternoon, in a tone pitched for 2 people and not a third, "is Walter Deering." The vote was about the Eastern County road assessment. Normally, that road maintenance would be paid out of the county fund, which Hale doesn't control. The vote moved it to a private contract, which ended up going to a company out of Wichita that, and this is common knowledge, Hale has an interest in. Evelyn kept her hands around her teacup and her face neutral. And Deering changed his vote. He voted against the contract the first time, held out for 2 meetings, then he voted for it. Clara refilled both cups. About 4 months after that, his daughter's mercantile business in Ellsworth got a very favorable loan from a bank that Hale's brother-in-law sits on the board of. The loan could be a coincidence. It could be, Clara agreed in the tone of someone who had never believed it was. Evelyn wrote Deering, road contract, Wichita company, Hale interest, loan to daughter in her notebook that evening. She drew a line from Deering's name to the surveyor Croft, then a line from Croft to the Henderson foreclosure. She was building something that looked less like a spider web and more like a diagram of how water moves, following the path of least resistance, wearing channels deeper over time. She needed one more thing. She needed to understand the money. Books. The money came into view, partially, through an unexpected source. One of the ranch hands from Cross Creek, Tomas, the young Mexican man who'd received his new coat with such warmth, came into Red Creek on a Wednesday afternoon and found her at her wagon. He looked both ways before stopping, which was not how people walk toward a normal transaction. "Miss Hart," he said quietly. "Tomas. Something wrong?" He turned his hat in his hands. He was maybe 22, with a careful, watchful face. "There is a man," he said, "in the saloon. I have seen him before. He is not from here." "What man?" "He is asking about the ranch, about Mr. Cross's finances, how many head he's running, what the mortgage situation is on the property." Tomas looked at her steadily. "He is asking the kind of questions you ask when you are looking for weakness." Evelyn kept her voice even. "Did you talk to him?" "No. I heard him. He is talking to Calloway, the outfitter, and Calloway is telling him things." His jaw tightened. "Calloway does not like Mr. Cross." "Do you know who sent this man?" Thomas gave her a look that said he had his guesses and they were the same as hers. She thanked him, and he walked back toward his horse, and she stood at the wagon for a moment thinking. Then she walked to the saloon. She didn't go inside. A woman going into the saloon alone in Red Creek in 1880 made a particular kind of statement, and it wasn't one she needed to make right now. But there were 2 windows that faced the street, and the light inside was on, and she positioned herself at the corner of the building where she could see through the glass without being obvious about it. She spotted Calloway at the bar, talking to a man she didn't recognize. Maybe 40, dressed better than a ranch hand, but not as well as a businessman with a flat leather satchel beside him on the bar. The kind of man you'd describe as tidy. The kind of man who traveled between places doing other people's paperwork. She watched for about 10 minutes. The man made notes. Calloway talked with the animation of someone who was enjoying being listened to. She walked back to her wagon and wrote down everything she'd seen. She told Gideon on Thursday. He sat across the work table in the outbuilding and listened without interrupting. He was good at that, at letting information come to him without shaping it before it arrived. When she finished, he looked at the wall for a moment and then back at her. "Financial inquiry?" he said. "Someone's trying to understand my debt structure. If they can argue you're overextended or find a lien they can exploit, they might not need the survey challenge. They might be able to apply pressure through the bank. My mortgage is with a bank in Hayes City. Is Hale connected to that bank?" "Not as far as I know." He paused. "But that doesn't mean much if he can get someone on the board to call the note early." She hadn't thought of that specific mechanism, but it fit the pattern. Can he do that? Is there a legal basis for calling the note early? There's always something in the fine print, if someone's motivated to read it that way. She exhaled slowly. It was that kind of fight. Not one dramatic confrontation, but a series of small pressures applied from multiple directions simultaneously, each one individually manageable, but combined designed to exhaust you into making a mistake or giving up. "You need to talk to your bank directly," she said, "not by letter, in person. Find out where your relationship stands with them and whether anyone has been asking questions." "I can ride to Hayes City next week." "Sooner," she said, "before the man with the satchel's report reaches whoever hired him." Gideon looked at her with an expression that had something complicated in it. Not quite frustration, not admiration, something in between. "You know you're not just selling winter gear anymore," he said. "I know." "What are you getting out of this, honestly?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about saying something clean and strategic, about how a stable county with fair land practices was good for business, about how stopping Hale would open the market for honest sellers. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. "He's the same type of man who took my family's land," she said. "I know that's personal. I'm not pretending it isn't, but personal doesn't mean wrong." She met his eyes. "I've been careful not to let this become a crusade. I'm pulling threads, not making speeches, and everything I've found is real." Gideon held her gaze for a moment. "I know it is," he said quietly. "Then ride to Hayes City before the week's out," she said. "Disham." He went on Friday. While he was gone, the weather changed. Not all at once. It never does in Kansas. It happened in increments. The temperature dropped 15 degrees between Thursday night and Friday morning. The wind came up from the northwest and didn't quit. The sky went from gray to a particular white that people who've lived through Plains winters know isn't just overcast. It's the sky making a decision. By Saturday morning, the first real snow had started. Not a blizzard, not yet. A steady, serious snowfall that covered Red Creek in several inches through the day and kept coming. People moved faster, conversation shortened. The saloon was full earlier than usual, not because of drink, but because there were fewer places warm enough to be. Evelyn sold steadily. This was the weather her goods were made for. Farmers came in from outlying homesteads for supplies and left with blankets. 3 more of Cross Creek's hands came in without Tomas this time and bought things that Gideon had apparently told them to buy. A family she hadn't met before, the Brower family. The mother with 2 daughters and a boy of about 12 came to her wagon, and the mother held a coat up to the boy, and her eyes went a certain way, and Evelyn told her the price, and the woman's face fell. "I can do layaway," Evelyn said. "Half now, half when you've got it." The woman looked at her. "You'd do that?" "I'd rather the boy have a coat that fits." She took half. She wrote it in her book under a different column. Not charity, not exactly. Just the ledger of things she did that didn't make immediate financial sense, but made some other kind of sense she couldn't easily name. Gideon came back Saturday evening, later than expected, with his horse tired and snow on his coat. He found her at the wagon. "Well?" she said. He climbed down. He had the look of a man who'd gotten an answer that confirmed something he hadn't wanted confirmed. "Someone has been inquiring about my account," he said. The bank's lending officer didn't know who, specifically. The inquiries had come through a letter from a law firm in Wichita he didn't recognize. He brushed snow off his sleeve. "But he showed me the letter. I copied the firm's name." She held out her hand. He gave her the paper. She looked at the name. Aldridge and Kemp, attorneys at law, Wichita, Kansas. "Do you know them?" she asked. "I didn't, but the banker did." He said Aldridge and Kemp are very well known in land acquisition litigation in the western part of the state. He paused. He said they work almost exclusively for one client type, large landholders looking to expand their holdings through legal means when direct purchase has failed. She folded the paper and gave it back. "So it's moving," she said. "It's moving." He looked at the sky. "And the weather's turning." He wasn't wrong about that. Standing there in the early dark with the snow coming steady and the wind building, she could feel it. That same atmospheric pressure she'd noticed 2 days ago, only now it was closer. Whatever was coming from the northwest was bigger than a normal snowfall. The signs were in the way the animals were behaving, the way the light fell wrong, the way the cold had a different weight to it. "You should get your camp inside somewhere tonight," he said. "Not the wagon. I'll see if Clara Webb has a room." "She does." "I know because I asked her this morning before I rode to Hays City." He said it without much ceremony, the way he said most things. "She said she'd hold a room." Evelyn looked at him. "You asked her before you left," she said. "You were going to be in town alone for 2 days in weather that was turning." He met her eyes. It seemed practical. She held his gaze for a moment and didn't say what was in her mind, which was that nobody had thought about her practical situation in the cold in 14 months. She said instead, "Thank you," in a voice she kept even. "There's more," he said. "About Hale." "Tell me inside. We're both going to freeze standing here." They walked toward the boarding house through the thickening snow, the town quiet around them, the light from the windows falling in yellow squares onto the white ground. She could hear the wind picking up in the spaces between buildings, that low building sound that meant it wasn't going to stop. Inside, Clara Webb set them up at the kitchen table with hot coffee and the studied incuriosity of a woman who knew that some conversations required privacy and provided it by simply not asking. Gideon set his hat on the table and looked at it for a moment. "I heard something in Hays City," he said. "Not from the bank, from a man I trust, who runs a law office there and keeps his ear to the ground." He looked up. "Hale is going to file a theft complaint." The coffee cup was warm in her hands. "Against who?" "Against me," he said. "Cattle theft. The complaint will claim that some of Hale's cattle, which were grazing on the land that the amended survey puts in his territory, were taken by persons from Cross Creek Ranch." He said it flat and tight. "It's not true, but once a theft complaint is filed with the sheriff, there's an investigation, and during an investigation I'm restricted from moving cattle or making land transfers, which means any legal challenge I file on the survey gets complicated. And meanwhile, Aldridge and Kemp files their claim on the 60 acres. Evelyn set her cup down. She thought through it carefully. The sequence of it, the timing. He files the theft complaint first, she said. That ties up your legal standing and your resources. Then Kemp files the land claim while you're defending yourself on the criminal side. Two fronts simultaneously. Can the theft complaint be answered? Yes. Eventually. But eventually is 6 months, 8 months, long enough to run me into trouble. She looked at the table. She thought about the survey papers spread out in the outbuilding. Prewitt's steady eyes and his willingness to make a sworn statement. Deering and the road contract, the loan to his daughter, Aldridge and Kemp, and the letters to the bank. Threads. All threads. She looked at Gideon. When is he going to file? She asked. My source says soon. Within the week, possibly. She thought about the weather outside. The snow that was coming down harder now, the wind that was building, the sky that had made its decision. Then we have less time than I thought, she said. Yes. She pulled out her notebook and opened it to the pages she'd been filling for 2 weeks. Tell me everything your source said, she said. All of it. Start from the beginning. He looked at the notebook, then at her face. The particular set of it, the focus she felt in herself when she was working. You know, he said, when I offered you workspace, I was thinking about your selling goods. I was not thinking about this. I know, she said. Tell me anyway. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the wind kept building, and somewhere to the northwest, the real storm was still coming, the kind that didn't care what any of them had planned. The theft complaint arrived on Monday. Evelyn heard about it before Gideon did. She was at Clara Webb's kitchen table drinking her morning coffee when the sheriff's deputy walked past the boarding house window toward the livery, and Clara, who had a lifetime's practice of reading the meaning in the way people moved through her town, set down her bread knife and said, That boy's walking official. 20 minutes later, the word was in the street. Gideon Cross, charged with the theft of 14 head of cattle belonging to Hale Land Holdings, allegedly grazed on disputed territory and removed by persons in the employ of Cross Creek Ranch. Sheriff Mac Tilden had issued the formal notice. Gideon was to present himself for questioning by Wednesday or a warrant would be issued. Evelyn sat with that information for the length of 1 coffee cup. Then she put on her coat and walked to the telegraph office. She sent 2 messages. The first went to her cousin in Abilene, asking for the name of the hardest-fighting land lawyer between Abilene and Hays City. The second went to a woman she'd met on the road 2 months ago, a former county clerk from Pawnee County who'd retired to Dodge City after 30 years of watching how land records moved, asking one specific question about the process for filing an amended survey without a triggering complaint. Then she went back to her wagon and sold gloves for 2 hours and tried not to let the tightness in her chest show. Gideon came to town that afternoon with Abe and Tomas flanking him in the quiet way that wasn't quite protection and wasn't quite not. He'd already sent his own message to Hays City. He presented himself to Tilden's office with his hat in his hand, and Evelyn watched from across the street, not pretending she wasn't watching. He came out 40 minutes later. He found her. Tilden's doing his job, he said, meaning the sheriff was following the process without enthusiasm. He doesn't look happy about it. Is Tilden Hale's man? No. He said it with the particular weight of something he'd thought about. Tilden is his own man, which is why Hale uses the courts and lawyers instead of the sheriff for this kind of thing. He can't count on Tilden to look the other way, so he files legal complaints that force Tilden to act whether he wants to or not. What happens at the Wednesday questioning? I tell the truth, which is that no Cross Creek cattle were moved from disputed territory, that none of my hands were near Hale's grazing land, that the cattle in question, if there are any cattle in question, which I suspect there are not, were nowhere near me. He'll have paperwork, she said. He'll have a count and a brand record and a witness. Gideon's jaw tightened. Yes. So we need something to counter it before Wednesday. The afternoon had gone cold and very still, in the particular way that preceded something significant in weather. The snow from Saturday had frozen hard underfoot. The sky was white in every direction, which was different from overcast. This was a loaded sky, heavy with what it was holding back. The response from Topeka, she said. From my contact. Did you get it? He pulled a folded telegram from his vest. She read it. The former county clerk, her name was Mabel Greer, and she had a memory like a courthouse archive, had written that an amended survey without a triggering complaint was technically permissible under Kansas land statute only if countersigned by two independent surveyors or by the county land commissioner. A single surveyor amendment without a commissioner's signature was procedurally irregular. Evelyn read it twice. Was there a commissioner's signature on the Croft amendment? Gideon stared at her. I don't know. I never looked for one. We need to look, she said. If that signature isn't there, the amendment is procedurally defective, which means the boundary line defaults to the 1872 survey, which means the land Hale claims to be grazing on is legally yours, which means there are no disputed cattle, he said slowly, which means the theft complaint is based on a fraudulent premise. They stood there in the cold looking at each other, and Evelyn felt the particular feeling she got when threads she'd been pulling separately suddenly pulled taut in the same direction. The survey papers are at the ranch, he said. Then we go tonight. They drove out to Cross Creek in the cold dark, the wagon lamp cutting a thin path through the black. The wind had started again from the northwest, not a gust, but a steady building pressure that made the horses lean slightly into it. Evelyn noticed. She'd been noticing the weather for 3 days. In the outbuilding, by lamplight, they spread the Croft Amendment on the table and read every inch of it. The surveyor's signature was there. Croft's hand, clear and practiced. Below it was a line for the county land commissioner's countersignature. The line was blank. Evelyn put her finger on it without speaking. Gideon stood very still. It's not there, he said. It's not there. He picked up the document and brought the lamp closer, as if proximity would produce a signature that hadn't been there a moment ago. It didn't. The countersignature line was empty. The document had been filed, recorded, and accepted by the county without the required second authorization. How did this get through? He said. The same way these things always get through. She thought of her father's ledger, the missing payment record. The clerk who received it either didn't check or was told not to check. The filing went into the record. Nobody pulled it out again because nobody had reason to look. Until now. Until now. He set the document down. He sat on the edge of the work table with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment in the way of a man who's been carrying a weight so long he stopped noticing it as a specific weight, and then suddenly someone points at it and he feels how heavy it actually is. 3 years, he said. 3 years of permits delayed and lawyers writing letters and Hale's men looking at my fence lines. I know. And it was right here. You didn't know what you were looking for, she said. Neither did I, until Mabel Greer told me what the statute required. She didn't say it to make him feel better. It was just true. You can't see what you don't know to look for. He straightened. The tiredness moved through his face and then settled back into something more workable. We need this in front of a judge before Wednesday. Hayes City. I'll write at first light. She looked at the window. The darkness outside was pressing close. The wind had picked up another register. She could hear it now in the eaves of the outbuilding. Leave tonight if you can, she said. The weather's changing. If it comes in fast, the roads will be impassable. He looked at her. I can't leave tonight. I've got 15 hands in stock to secure if a storm's coming. She thought about that. Send Abe with the document. Is Abe steady? Abe is the steadiest man I know. Give him the survey. Give him Prewitt's statement. Give him a letter from you authorizing him to deliver to your lawyer in Hayes City with instructions to file an emergency injunction on the theft complaint before Wednesday. She looked at him. Tonight, before the roads turn. Gideon Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the main house. She waited in the outbuilding, listening to the wind. Abe left inside the hour, wrapped in a heavy coat, and with the documents in an oilskin pouch inside his vest. He was a man who didn't say much but moved with the reliability of someone who understood the weight of what he was carrying. He took the fastest horse in the barn and went south first to avoid the worst of the northwest wind, which Gideon said was the smarter road. Evelyn stayed the night at Cross Creek. There was a spare room in the main house that one of the hands had vacated, and she took it without ceremony because the drive back to town in the dark, with the wind doing what it was doing, made no sense. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the building sounds of the storm and thought about the blank countersignature line on a document that had been sitting in a county land file for years, waiting. By morning, the world had changed. She knew it before she opened her eyes. The sound had gone differently, the way sound does when there's deep snow absorbing it. And the cold. The cold had a different quality, a serious pressing weight that came through the walls in a way that yesterday's cold hadn't. She dressed fast and went to the window. The snow was past her wagon wheel hubs, still falling, not the gentle, steady fall of Saturday, but something harder, more horizontal, driven by a wind that was coming from the northwest with a velocity that meant the storm had arrived in full and had no plans to apologize for it. She went to the kitchen. Tomas was at the stove. Two other hands were at the table eating fast. Gideon was already in his coat at the door. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough." He pulled on his gloves. The temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight. Winds at 40, gusting higher. I've got cattle in the east pasture I need to bring in before they drift into the fence lines. How long will that take? Rest of the morning if everything goes right. Longer if it doesn't. He looked at her. You should stay here. The town road is drifting badly. She thought about her wagon, about the inventory, $400 worth of goods sitting under canvas in this wind, about Clara Webb's boarding house and the people in it. I need to get back to town, she said. Evelyn, my wagon's not secured for this. And if the storm gets worse, people in town are going to need... She stopped. She knew how it sounded. People in town are going to need things. She didn't know exactly what she was anticipating, only that the weight of what was coming pressed on her in a way that felt specific. Take the bay mare, he said. She knows the road. Don't try to bring your wagon. She took the bay mare. What? The ride into Red Creek was the most unpleasant 40 minutes of her recent memory, which included sleeping in a frozen wagon through 3 plains nights. The wind drove the snow sideways, and there were places where the road disappeared entirely into the white, and the mare had to find it by instinct. Evelyn rode with her head down and her coat wrapped twice and counted the minutes. She reached town at mid-morning, Red Creek. In a blizzard looked like a town under siege. The boardwalks were disappearing. Most storefronts had their shutters pulled. A few horses stood outside the saloon with their heads down and their tails clamped, miserable and patient. The street was empty of people in the way a street gets empty when the weather has made the decision for everyone. She found her wagon. The canvas was still up, but the wind had gotten under one side and 2 coats had blown into the snow. She packed them in and tied the canvas down tighter and moved the wagon against the wall of the feed store where there was some windbreak. Casper was at the livery, which was good. The livery man kept his animals in, which was the sensible thing. She was working the last tie on the canvas when she heard it. A sound from further down the street, not the wind, not the crack of wood, but a human voice. High and thin and going the wrong direction, which was away from buildings and toward the open ground at the north end of town where nothing stood between Red Creek and whatever was coming out of Nebraska. She straightened and looked. A woman, Mrs. Brower, the mother who'd bought the half-price coat, was standing in the street in front of the general store, looking north. She was turning in a slow, horrified circle. Evelyn walked toward her fast. What happened? She said. Mrs. Brower grabbed her arm. The woman's face was the color of old ash. My boy, Willem. He went for the... She pointed toward the north end where the street opened into open ground. He was going to the neighbors to get their dog in, and I turned around for 1 minute. Evelyn looked north. The visibility was maybe 50 yards. Past that was white nothing. How long ago? 5 minutes? Maybe 10? I don't know. I came looking for... Evelyn was already moving. She went back to the wagon and unrolled the rope she kept tied under the gate. Heavy hemp, 60 feet. She worked fast, her fingers clumsy in the cold, but finding the motions from muscle memory. She tied one end to the wagon's back axle. She coiled the rest over her shoulder. Is there another rope in the feed store? She called to Mrs. Brower. I don't know. Find out. She didn't wait. She walked north into the white. The wind hit her immediately. Not like wind does when you're protected by buildings, but the full weight of it. The unmediated force of a plains blizzard with no obstacle between it and you. It pushed her sideways. She leaned into it and kept walking, counting steps, paying out rope behind her. 10 steps from the last building, the world turned white in every direction. There was no up or down in any useful sense. Just the wind and the cold and the ground under her feet. She kept her head down. She shouted the boy's name. The wind ate the sound. She kept walking. She counted feet of rope. She shouted again. At maybe 40 feet of rope, she nearly stepped on him. He'd gone down in a drift that had built against a fence post. Not a high drift, but enough to trip a small boy who'd lost his bearings, and once down, the cold had done what cold does, and the fight had gone out of him fast. He was curled on his side with his knees to his chest, and he was conscious. She could hear him making a sound, a thin, sustained sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. But his hands, when she grabbed them, were wrong. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you. Stay with me." She got him upright. He couldn't walk on his own. His legs had gone unreliable, whether from cold or fear or both. She pulled his arm over her shoulder and took his weight, which was more than you'd think for a 12-year-old, and she turned back toward the rope. The problem was the rope had drifted under snow in the time she'd been out, and finding the direction of it wasn't simple. She kept her grip on the end she was holding and turned slowly until she felt the tension. Then she walked. Her hands were burning. She was aware of that with a certain clinical separation, the kind where your body is registering pain, but the part of your mind that handles priority has pushed it down the list. The boy was a dead weight against her shoulder, still making that sound. "Keep making noise," she told him. "Don't stop." "I'm cold," he said. "I know. Keep talking. Tell me your dog's name." Barley." "Good dog name. Tell me about Barley." He told her about Barley and the halting, tooth-chattering way of someone using speech as an anchor, and she pulled them both along the rope through the white nothing, one hand gripping the hemp and one hand gripping the boy's arm. And at some point she stopped counting feet because the counting took attention she needed for the walking. Light appeared ahead, yellow and diffuse through the snow, but light. She got them back to the street. Mrs. Brower made a sound Evelyn had never heard before and never forgot, the sound of a mother who had been watching the white nothing for the last 10 minutes, understanding that what she'd been afraid of wasn't going to happen. She took the boy and held him and made sounds over him that weren't words. Evelyn stood in the wind with the rope still over her shoulder and felt the burning in her hands come back to full volume now that it was allowed to. There were people. She hadn't noticed them gathering, 3, 4, 5 people who'd been watching from doorways or had come out when they heard Mrs. Brower. They were looking at her the way people look at something they're trying to process. She became aware that she was shaking, not dramatically, just the deep involuntary shake of a body that has been holding something tight and is now releasing it. "Get him warm," she said to Mrs. Brower. It came out steadier than she felt. "Feet and hands. Warm them slowly, not too fast." Someone took her arm. She didn't see who. She was guided toward the nearest building, which was the general store, and the door opened, and the heat inside hit her like something physical. But the storm did not stop. Through that afternoon it got worse, the wind higher, the temperature dropping, the snow coming so hard and fast that the space between buildings became genuinely dangerous. A section of roof on the old livery extension came down under the weight of accumulated snow. One of the boarding house windows cracked from the pressure and had to be boarded over with planks that Hendricks had in his back storeroom. Evelyn was in the general store with her hands wrapped around a heated iron when she understood what she was looking at. The town's wood supply in the general store was the last community stock. Most households had their own, but the storm had lasted longer than anticipated, and the cold was hard enough that consumption was faster than normal. By evening, there would be families in Red Creek burning furniture to stay warm. She looked at her inventory. The coats were already doing what coats do. She'd given 2 of them, off her own back, to a family who'd been caught on the road outside town and come in half frozen. The blankets were in the wagon, still wrapped. She thought about the dollar value of what she'd brought to Red Creek. She thought about the $62 she'd started with and what she'd built on it. She thought about reopening somewhere new in spring with new inventory. She went to the wagon. She brought the blankets inside. All of them. The 32 blankets she'd carried from Pratt County and worked on every night by lamplight and built into a stock that was supposed to fund the next 6 months of her life. She brought them into the general store, and Hendricks watched her set them on the counter without speaking. "How many families in this town?" she said. He blinked. 40, 50 households. "Is there a list?" "There's a church registry." "Get it." She organized it herself. Not because she was efficient at organizing, though she was, but because the doing of it kept the part of her brain that was calculating losses in a manageable background register, instead of the foreground where it would paralyze her. She divided blankets by household size, prioritized families with young children, gave 2 each to the households at the far edges of town, where the cold came in hardest. Hendricks watched her work. After about 20 minutes, he went to his back storeroom and came back with an armload of wool batting he'd been keeping for other purposes. "Not blankets," he said, "but it helps." She looked at him. He set it on the counter. He had the expression of a man who was aware he was making a choice and aware of what it cost him and going ahead anyway. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said gruffly. "Just use it." They distributed it together. By late afternoon, the wind had reached the kind of velocity that made sound irrelevant. It was simply a constant roar that you stopped hearing individually and started just living inside. The temperature outside was brutal. Inside the general store, with the stove burning hard and every blanket in the town doing its work, it was survivable. 3 families who'd been trying to wait out the storm in the hotel had run out of wood upstairs and come down. Clara Webb had sent a hand, one of the men who helped her with maintenance, to bring 6 elderly residents from their homes to the boarding house before the road between became impassable. People were doing what people do when weather removes every option except the one in front of you. They helped. Evelyn worked for 7 hours straight. She stopped counting at some point what she was giving away, and just gave. A coat here. A second blanket for a family with a sick child. The remaining wool batting divided between 2 houses on the north end. She kept her own coat and the clothes she was wearing and let everything else go. Toward evening, the wind began to relent, not all at once. Came down in stages, the roar dropping to something lower, the direction shifting slightly, the snow easing from horizontal to something closer to vertical. The specific ferocity of the storm had peaked. She was sitting against the back wall of the general store with her knees pulled up and her eyes closed when she heard someone come in from outside. The door opened and shut fast, a blast of cold entering and being expelled. She opened her eyes. Gideon Cross stood in the doorway with snow on every surface of him, and his face red from wind and his coat so stiff with ice it could have stood without him in it. He looked around the store, at the families, at the stove and the blankets, and the people distributed across the floor, at the empty space where her inventory had been. He looked at her. "You gave it all away," he said. It wasn't a question. "Not all of it," she said. "I kept my coat." He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her and looked at her hands. They were better than they'd been. Someone had found some tallow and she'd worked it into her fingers. But the cold had left its mark, the skin red and stiff and tender. "The boy?" he said, warming up at Clara Webb's. "He's going to be all right." He was very close. The cold was still coming off his coat in waves. He looked at her with the kind of expression that is almost impossible to sustain, too much in it to hold for long without some of it escaping. "I heard from the road coming in," he said. "People talking about what you did. I pulled a kid out of a drift. The rope did most of it." "Evelyn." She looked at him. His voice had changed register. "I know what you gave up," he said. "I know what was in that wagon." She held his gaze. "I know what it was worth," she said. "I'm not pretending it wasn't a lot, but a blanket is a blanket, and a kid is a kid, and I know which one matters more, so that part was easy." She paused. "The rest of it, the fear, the cold, the not being able to see in any direction, that part was less easy." Something worked through his expression. He put his hand over hers. Not the dramatic gesture of a story, just a hand on top of a hand, warm from the inside where the cold hadn't reached. "Abe made it to Hayes City," he said. "He telegraphed from there this morning. The lawyer is filing the injunction today." She exhaled slowly. "And the countersignature," he said. "Your instinct was right. The lawyer says an amendment without the commissioner's countersignature has no legal standing. The filing is procedurally void. Hale's claim on the 60 acres isn't a claim," she said. "Isn't a claim," he confirmed, "which makes his theft complaint based on cattle grazing land that belongs to you." Yes, outside the wind was still running, lower now, but persistent. Inside the stove crackled and the town breathed. Mrs. Brower was across the room with her son asleep against her side and a cross-creek blanket over them both. "There's still the matter of the complaint," she said. "He'll find another angle." "He will." Gideon didn't look away from her. But the ground he's standing on just got much smaller. He paused. "We have the survey. We have Prewitt's statement. We have the procedural defect, and tomorrow, when this storm clears, half the town is going to have reason to think about who was handing out blankets and who was sitting in a warm house on the East Road. She looked at him. I wasn't thinking about that. I know you weren't. He almost smiled. That's probably why it matters. She looked down at his hand on hers. She thought about what came next. The legal fight, the lawyer in Hayes City, Deering and the road contract, the Aldridge and Kemp letters, the thread she'd been pulling for 3 weeks, all of it still ahead. But tonight the storm was breaking, and the town was warm, and a boy was sleeping with a blanket over him who might not have been sleeping otherwise. She let herself feel that for a moment before the rest came back. Outside, for the first time in 2 days, you could see stars in the gap where the storm had moved east. The storm left Red Creek the way bad things sometimes do. Not with drama, but with a quiet withdrawal, the wind dropping off in the night, and the temperature lifting just enough by morning that the cold became something manageable rather than something lethal. The town woke to a world buried in white. The main street drifted past the boardwalk rails. The rooftops weighted down. The whole landscape rearranged into something unfamiliar and still. People came out carefully. They checked on neighbors. They dug pathways between buildings. They assessed damage with the methodical practicality of people who'd lived through plains winters before and understood that what the storm took you counted later, after you'd confirmed everyone was breathing. What the storm had left behind, apart from the snow, was harder to measure. Evelyn understood this in the first hour of that morning when she walked from the boarding house to the general store and 3 people stopped her on the way. Not to buy anything, not to ask about her goods, just to speak to her. A nod, a hand on her arm, a brief word about the blankets, about the boy, about the way she'd walked into the white with a rope over her shoulder and come back with someone else's child. Mrs. Farrell, who'd bought the first blanket, who'd said it was the finest she'd touched in 10 years, stopped her at the corner and held her hands for a moment without saying much of anything, which communicated more than words would have. Evelyn accepted this with as much grace as she could, which wasn't a great deal. She was not built for being looked at with that particular softness. It made something in her chest feel complicated and exposed in a way that fighting the cold hadn't. She went to the general store. Hendricks was already open. He handed her a coffee without being asked, which was its own statement from a man who didn't make statements easily. "Your wagon's still in one piece," he said. "I had the boy check it at first light." "Thank you." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for when you first came in." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man pulling something up from a depth where it had been sitting for a while. "You don't have to," she started. "I turned you away because you were a woman selling out of a wagon, and I made a judgment before I'd seen the work." He set his cup down. "That was wrong, and the work was good. Better than what I carry." He paused. "I'd like to discuss terms, if you're still interested in the store arrangement." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the first afternoon she'd walked in here with a sample bundle and stood on the wrong side of his crossed arms. "I'm interested," she said. "Good." He picked his cup back up in the manner of a man who'd said what he came to say and was now ready to move forward. "Whenever you're ready?" She was ready. But first there was the matter of Victor Hale. The injunction from Hayes City arrived by telegraph on Wednesday morning, 48 hours after Abe had ridden through the beginning of the blizzard with the documents in his vest. Gideon's lawyer, a man named Ferris, who apparently did have a harder reputation, as Evelyn had requested, had filed the emergency motion challenging the procedural validity of the Croft Survey Amendment and simultaneously requesting a stay on the theft complaint pending resolution of the boundary dispute. The judge in Hayes City had granted the stay, which meant the Wednesday questioning with Sheriff Tilden was postponed indefinitely, and the theft complaint was in legal limbo while the survey question worked its way through the process. Tilden came to find Evelyn at the general store. He was a tall man with a gray beard trimmed shorter than Hale's and eyes that had the specific wariness of someone who'd spent 20 years watching a county's politics run through his office. He sat down across from her at the table Hendricks had let her use near the back window and put his hat on his knee. "I need to understand what I'm sitting in the middle of," he said. She told him. Not everything. Not the notebook, not Deering, not the Aldridge and Kemp letters yet. She told him about the survey amendment, the missing countersignature, Prewitt's witness statement, and the sequence of pressures on Cross Creek Ranch over the past 3 years. She laid it out plainly, the way she'd written it in the notebook, without editorializing. Tilden listened without speaking. When she finished, he looked at his hat for a moment. "I knew the Henderson situation wasn't clean," he said, "but I had no legal foothold to get into it. By the time I heard enough to ask questions, the family was gone, and the land transfer was recorded." "This is different," she said. "This one has a procedural defect in the official record. That's not hearsay. That's a document that doesn't meet the legal requirements of its own filing statute." "You've been busy," he said, not unkindly. "I've been paying attention." He looked at her directly. "If I start pulling this thread officially, it doesn't stay small. Victor Hale has lawyers, and he has money, and he has 20 years of relationships in this county. Whatever comes out of it is going to be ugly, and it's going to take time. I know that. Are you prepared for what that looks like aimed at you?" She thought about the man who'd knocked her display into the mud, the careful warning about Wichita, the man with the satchel asking questions about Gideon's finances. "I think he's already aimed at me," she said. "I'd rather be moving than standing still." Tilden looked at her for another long moment. He was the kind of man who thought in real time, and you could see it in his face, working through the angles, the costs, the specific position he was in. "If I go to the county land commissioner with the survey defect," he said, "that opens a formal investigation. That's public record." "Yes." "And if the investigation finds what you're suggesting it finds, then the boundary reverts. The 60 acres go back to Cross Creek. The theft complaint has no basis." She looked at him. "And whoever helped Victor Hale file a procedurally defective survey amendment with the county has questions to answer." Tilden put his hat back on his head with the decisive motion of someone who has reached the edge of the time they're willing to spend thinking and is now choosing. "I'll go to the commissioner tomorrow," he said. "You'll need to give me a formal written account of the survey discrepancy and the Prewitt statement. I can have it written by tonight." He stood, looked at her once more with that assessing look. "You know," he said, "when you drove into town with that wagon, I don't think a single person expected you to still be here 3 weeks later." "I'm aware of that," she said. He left. She sat at the table for a moment and wrote Tilden, going to commissioner, tomorrow in her notebook, and then she went to find Gideon. The thing about applying pressure to a man like Hale was that you couldn't do it quietly. Hale had built his position over 20 years through quiet mechanisms, documents filed without fanfare, complaints lodged through intermediaries, money moved through trusts and shell arrangements that left his name at a comfortable distance from the outcome. He was very good at operating in the spaces where oversight didn't naturally go. Public exposure was his weakness. Evelyn understood this in the abstract when she'd started pulling threads. She understood it more concretely on Thursday, when the news of the Hays City injunction spread through Red Creek, the way news spreads in small towns. Not through any announcement, but through the specific channels of people who know things talking to people who need to know things. By midday, the shape of it was visible in the way people moved. Conversations that had previously folded up when she approached started staying open. Walter Deering, the councilman, whom she had not approached directly since learning his name, came into the general store while she was there and looked at her with an expression she could only describe as a man checking his own footing. She didn't go to him. She let him stand there for a moment and then turned back to the coat she was showing Hendricks for the store's inventory. 20 minutes later, Deering came to her. "Miss Hart," he said. He had a politician's voice, smooth, trained, the kind of voice that usually knew what it was going to say before it said it. Right now, it sounded like it wasn't sure. "Mr. Deering." He stood at the counter with his hands in his coat pockets. "I've been hearing things," he said. She waited. "About the Cross Creek situation." He glanced at Hendricks, who made a show of finding something to do at the other end of the counter. "About the survey irregularity." "That's a matter of public record now," she said. "The injunction's been filed in Hays City. Anyone can look at the documents." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter and then back at her. "There are people in this county who are going to be in a difficult position when this comes out fully." "I imagine so." "People who may have been in situations where they didn't feel they had many options." She kept her voice even. People in those situations often have more options than they realize, she said, particularly if they come forward early rather than wait to be found. Something moved across his face. It was fear, but it was also something else. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something and has just been told there might be a way to set it down without destroying himself. If a person were to provide information, he said carefully, voluntarily, to the appropriate authorities, that carries significantly more weight than information provided under compulsion, she said. In my understanding, though you'd want to consult a lawyer on the specifics. He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. The road contract, he said. The vote. I want you to understand that I was told. He stopped. He started again. I was led to believe that the situation with my daughter's business would resolve itself naturally, without any connection to my vote. The connection was implied rather than stated. Implications are often the clearest form of communication, she said. He looked at her. He had the slightly undone look of a man whose carefully maintained surface had developed a crack and wasn't sure how much was coming through it. Tilden, he said. Should I go to Tilden? I think that would be wise, she said. Today, if possible. He left. Hendricks reappeared from the far end of the counter. You didn't give him much comfort, Hendricks said. He'll find comfort in doing the right thing, she said. Eventually. But Deering went to Tilden that afternoon. Evelyn knew because Clara Webb knew, and Clara Webb knew because the woman who cleaned Tilden's office had seen Deering come in and stay for an hour and a half. By dinner, half of Red Creek had the outline of it. The official investigation opened on Friday. The county land commissioner, a careful, deliberate man named Stoll, who had the somewhat unfortunate position of being entirely honest in a county where that hadn't always been an advantage, agreed to review the Croft Amendment under the procedural challenge. He brought in a surveyor from the next county, a man who had no history in Red Creek and no relationship with anyone involved. The independent surveyor's report took 4 days. Evelyn spent those 4 days selling what she had left, writing down everything she knew in organized form for Tilden and for Ferris, the lawyer in Hayes City, and sleeping worse than she had in weeks. Not because she was afraid exactly, because she was close to something that might fall either way, and she'd learned enough about how these things worked to know that being right and being able to prove it were two different countries. On the 4th day, she was at her wagon. She'd rebuilt a small display with the last of her inventory, the things she'd managed to keep dry through the storm. When Gideon came up the street on horseback, at a pace that wasn't quite a gallop, but wasn't anything slower than urgency. He got down. He looked at her. The surveyor confirmed it, he said. Original boundary, 42 yards east of the creek, same as Pruitt said. The Croft Amendment is officially void. She felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for so long she'd stopped feeling it as tension. And the 60 acres? Revert to Cross Creek. Stowell is recording the correction today. He looked like a man who had been expecting to hear something and then heard it and still wasn't quite sure it was real. Hale's land claim through Aldridge and Kemp is based on the amended survey. Without the amendment, the claim has no legal foundation. They can file something else, she said. They will. I know. Ferris says they'll try other angles, but they've lost this one publicly, which changes the terrain. He paused. And Deering's statement changes things further. If there's documented evidence of Hale's steering council votes in exchange for financial benefits, that's not a civil matter. That's criminal. The word sat between them with its proper weight. Tilden's building the case? She asked. Tilden has been building the case since Tuesday, he said. Apparently he's been wanting to build it for 3 years and waiting for something solid enough to start with. She looked down the street. The town was going about its mid-morning business. A woman with a basket, a man loading supplies, 2 horses at the rail in front of the hotel. The ordinary texture of a place that didn't yet know how much was shifting beneath it. It's not done, she said. No, he agreed, but it's moving in one direction now instead of staying still. She looked back at him. How are the hands? After the storm? He accepted the subject change, which told her he understood why she needed to make it. Everyone's fine. Lost 2 cattle to the cold, drifted into a gully. Could have been worse. He looked at her display, the small remaining inventory she'd laid out. What are you going to do? About the goods? Sell what I have, save what I can. She picked up a glove from the display and straightened it. I made an arrangement with Hendricks. He's going to carry my things in the store. That's what you wanted when you came here. Yes. Is it still enough? She looked at him. It was a different question than it sounded. She could hear the other thing in it. It's a start, she said carefully. Things in Red Creek are more complicated than they were when I drove in. They are, he said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that had too much in it to say simply. I'm glad you're still here. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. He nodded once, then turned his horse and headed back east. She watched him go and then turned back to her display and thought about the next thing she needed to do. Victor Hale came to see her on Saturday. She'd half expected it. What she hadn't expected was the timing, 10 in the morning, in front of Hendricks' General Store, with people moving up and down the boardwalk and the street traffic of a weekend market day all around them. He hadn't sought privacy this time. He came alone. No man flanking him, no horse. He walked up the street on foot, which was unusual enough that people noticed. He stopped in front of her display. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago when he'd stood at her wagon in the evening and told her about Wichita. Not dramatically. He hadn't changed in any way she could have pointed to. It was something in how he held himself, a tightness that hadn't been there before. You've been busy, Miss Hart, he said. I have, she said. I underestimated you. He said it simply, without the pleasant coating of his earlier conversations. I'd like to know what it's going to take. She looked at him. Take for what? To stop. His voice was flat and controlled. You've made your point. You've given Tilden what he needed to open a formal investigation. You've created a situation that is going to be expensive and unpleasant for a number of people. He met her eyes. I'm asking what stops here. She set down the glove she'd been holding. Mr. Hale, she said, I'm a seamstress selling winter goods out of a wagon. I pulled a boy out of a snowdrift and helped some people stay warm. The investigation that's open right now is being run by Sheriff Tilden and the county land commissioner. What happens next is their job, not mine. He looked at her steadily. You know what I'm asking. I know, she said, and I'm telling you the truth. I don't have a price. I haven't been doing this for leverage. She held his gaze. I've been doing it because you are exactly the same kind of man who took my family's land, and I understand how you work, and I had the information and the time, and I wasn't willing to look away from it. Something moved in his face. Not quite anger, not quite fear. It was the expression of a man who has operated in a world where everything has a negotiable value coming up against something that doesn't. You can't prove. I don't have to prove anything, she said. Tilden does. And he has Deering's statement and the survey correction and your own filing history with the county and a lawyer in Hayes City who is apparently quite good at making judges uncomfortable. She paused. I'd suggest you speak to your own lawyers. He looked at her for one more long moment. The morning light was hard and clear, the way it gets after a blizzard when there's nothing in the air to soften it. He turned and walked away. She watched him go. She waited until he'd turned the corner and disappeared from sight, and then she picked up the glove again with hands that were entirely steady, which she was grateful for. Hendricks appeared in the doorway. He doesn't look well, Hendricks observed. No, she said. He doesn't. The investigation moved at the pace that investigations in 1880 Kansas were capable of moving, which was measured more in weeks than in days. But it moved with a momentum that Hale's lawyers couldn't stop once Deering had given his statement, because Deering's statement was detailed and specific and opened doors into things that had been closed. The road contract was the first thing. The Wichita company that had received the contract was traced through its ownership structure to a holding entity connected to Hale's business interests. Not directly, not in a way that was obvious, but the structure was there once someone was looking for it. The county council had voted to direct public money into a private arrangement that ultimately benefited Hale. Deering's testimony that this had been steered through implied promises made the financial motive explicit. That gave Tilden the foundation for a broader inquiry into Hale's land acquisition practices. The Henderson foreclosure came back up. Tilden located John Henderson through a contact in the territory, and Henderson, who had been carrying the anger of 3 years since he'd watched his family's land get taken, came back to Red Creek to give a statement. He sat across from Tilden and described the loan dispute, the missing receipt, the way the foreclosure had proceeded with a speed that didn't match the normal pace of county legal process. More people came forward, not a flood. It was never a flood because people in small counties in 1880 had long memories and didn't trust that the ground had shifted until it clearly had. But steadily. A former county clerk who'd been present when a complaint was filed against another rancher and had always thought the timing was strange. A hand who'd once worked for Hale and had been asked to move cattle in a way that didn't make sense at the time. A woman whose family had sold land to Hale under pressure she could now describe with specificity. Evelyn wrote statements. This was something she hadn't anticipated, that her particular skill with language and structure, developed over years of ledger keeping and contract reading, would turn out to be useful in this specific way. Tilden could take testimony, but turning testimony into a clear, organized, legally legible document was a different skill, and he knew it. You have a gift for this, he told her one afternoon at his office, looking at a 3-page account she'd written up from a 2-hour conversation with the former clerk. My father taught me that a document is only as useful as someone can understand it, she said. He was talking about ranch ledgers, but it applies. Your father was a practical man. He was. She thought of him, his careful handwriting, the way he'd taught her to balance accounts, the way he'd died 4 months after the land went. He should have had people like this, she said quietly, when it happened to him. Tilden looked at her with the directness of a man who'd been in law enforcement long enough to understand what that sentence contained. I'm sorry, he said. So am I, she said, but I'm here instead of there. So, she picked up the next statement. Desenjoy. The arrest came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the blizzard. It wasn't dramatic in the way of dime novels. Victor Hale didn't flee or fight or deliver speeches. Tilden rode out to Hale's property with a deputy and a warrant signed by a judge in Hays City, and Hale came out of his house and looked at the paper and looked at Tilden and said, very quietly, I'll get my coat. He was charged with filing a fraudulent land document, conspiracy to manipulate county council proceedings, and extortion. The last charge tied to the documented evidence that Deering had been manipulated through implied financial threats, and that the Henderson foreclosure had involved the deliberate suppression of a valid payment record. The payment record turned out to be the key that unlocked the last door. When the former clerk's statement had pointed Tilden toward the original Henderson loan documents, Ferris, the lawyer, had filed a discovery motion requiring the current holder of those documents, which turned out to be an entity connected to Hale Land Holdings, to produce them for court review. The documents produced showed the payment history, and the payment history had 1 month missing, but John Henderson had kept a copy of his receipt book. He'd carried it with him when he left. 3 years in a territory without land, doing day labor, waiting for something he wasn't sure was ever coming. And he'd kept the receipt book because it was proof, even if no one was asking for proof, even if having proof had done him no good at all the first time. The receipt for the missing month was there, in Henderson's handwriting, dated, signed, the amount matching what the loan required. The Henderson family's land was ordered returned. John Henderson sat in Tilden's office when that news came through and put his face in his hands for a moment that Evelyn, who happened to be at the desk in the corner when it happened, looked away from because some things are private even when they happen in public. Hale was convicted on all 3 counts in the spring term at the county court. His lawyers argued process and procedure, but the accumulation of evidence, the survey, the road contract, the Henderson payment record, Deering's testimony, the statements from 7 other individuals, was too specific and too corroborated to unwind. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in the state penitentiary and ordered the liquidation of Hale Land Holdings' questionable acquisitions for the purpose of compensating those who'd been defrauded. Red Creek watched all of this with the complicated feeling of a town that has lived under a man's influence for so long that removing him feels both like relief and like standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged. The space is better, but you keep reaching for things where they used to be. Evelyn was there for the verdict. She stood at the back of the courtroom in Hays City, a room that smelled of sawdust and wool and old paper, and listened to the judge read the verdict in a flat, clear voice that made no accommodation for the weight of what it was saying. Gideon was beside her. He'd been beside her for most of the past 6 weeks, in the specific way that two people can be beside each other without it being declared: present, useful, increasingly necessary. When the verdict was read, his hand found hers in the crowd, and she let it stay there. Walking out of the courthouse into the cold Kansas air, she thought about her father's land, about the payment that had disappeared from the bank's records, about the man who'd held their note and decided he wanted it. She didn't know his name was anything like Victor Hale. She didn't know if there had been a receipt book somewhere that might have changed things if someone had known to look for it. She thought about Prewitt's clear eyes and his willingness to put his name on a statement, about Deering, who had been afraid for 3 years and had found his way to a different choice, about John Henderson in Tilden's office, with his face in his hands. She thought about her father saying, "They make you think it's your bad luck until the moment you realize it was their plan." She'd pulled one thread in one county in Kansas. She was not naive enough to think that changed the world, or that the next county over didn't have its own version of Victor Hale operating in the same quiet spaces where oversight didn't naturally go. But she was still here. And the ground was different now than it had been when she'd driven into Red Creek on a frozen morning 3 months ago with a wagon full of handmade winter gear and a town that had already made up its mind about her. "You're quiet," Gideon said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She looked at the street, at the people going about the ordinary business of a Kansas town that didn't know or care that a verdict had just been read 30 feet away. "About what's next," she said. He looked at her. "There's a building," he said, "on the main street in Red Creek, between the feed store and Hendricks. It's been empty since the milliner left last year. It's got good light, and it's solid, and the owner is a sensible man who wants a sensible tenant." She looked at him. "I spoke to him," Gideon said, "in the event you were interested." She held his gaze. "You spoke to him before the verdict." "I spoke to him last week," he admitted. "I thought regardless of what happened today, you'd earned the right to stop selling out of a wagon." She looked at him for a long moment, at the weathered face and the gray at his temples, and the expression that was trying to be practical and wasn't entirely succeeding. "You were very sure about me," she said. "Not at first," he said. "At first I just bought gloves." She almost smiled. She looked back at the street. "Show me the building," she said. The building was exactly what Gideon had said it was. Good light, solid walls, the kind of space that had been waiting for someone to understand what it was for. Evelyn stood in the middle of it the first time with her coat still on and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and looked at the dimensions. The front room was wide enough for display tables and a counter. The back room had a wood stove that needed a new flue pipe and a set of shelves along the east wall that were built well enough to hold serious weight. The floors were pine, worn but intact. The windows, 3 of them across the front facing the main street, let in the kind of afternoon light that made colors true, which mattered when you were selling things where color and texture were part of the value. She walked the perimeter. She stood at the windows and looked at the street. She went to the back room and checked the stove and the shelves and the ceiling for water damage. Then she turned to Gideon, who had been standing near the door with the patience of a man who understood that some decisions needed to be made without commentary. "Tell me the rent," she said. He told her. It was fair. More than fair. It was the rent of a man who wanted the building occupied by someone who'd take care of it rather than the rent of a man squeezing a tenant. "I'll take it," she said. She opened Hart Frontier Outfitters on the 15th of March, 1881, on a day that was still cold, but had the particular quality of late winter cold that means something is coming to an end. She'd spent 6 weeks getting the space right. Not decorated, not polished, but functional in a way that made sense. The display tables she'd had built by the same carpenter who'd done the shelves in Hendrick's back room, a man named Colby who charged fair and worked straight. The counter she'd found in pieces in the building's storage room and restored herself over 2 weeks of evenings, the wood coming back to something decent with linseed oil and thyme. She'd ordered new inventory, wool from 2 suppliers she'd built relationships with over the past year on the road, leather from a tannery in Salina that her cousin had recommended. She'd made the first 20 pieces herself the way she always started, to have something real on the walls before the larger stock arrived. The morning she opened, she unlocked the door at 7 and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. The main street of Red Creek was beginning its morning. Smoke from chimneys, the liveryman leading a horse out for the day, Hendricks opening his shutters across and down the street. He saw her and lifted a hand. She went inside and waited. Clara Webb was her first customer. She came in at 7:15 with the directness of someone who'd planned this and bought a wool scarf she'd admired in the window, then stood at the counter for a few minutes, not quite leaving. "This is a good thing," Clara said, looking around the store. "It's a start," Evelyn said. "You always say that." "It's always true." Clara looked at her. "Are you happy?" Evelyn considered this question seriously, the way it deserved. "I don't know if happy is the right word for what I am right now," she said. "But I'm not afraid. That's something I haven't been able to say for a long time." Clara nodded as if that was the correct answer and left. Both done. The store found its footing faster than she'd expected, and slower in ways she hadn't anticipated. The fast part was the goods. Red Creek had a real need for quality winter gear, and Evelyn understood that need in the specific, granular way you only understand a market after you've spent 3 months standing in it in all weather, listening. She knew who needed work gloves and who needed dress gloves. She knew which families were stretched thin and built in a layaway arrangement as a standard offering rather than an exception. She knew the ranch supply patterns, and she'd already established relationships with most of the operations within 20 miles. So the commercial accounts came without much effort. The slow part was the staff. She'd wanted from the beginning to hire women, not out of sentiment, out of the specific knowledge that there were women in Red Creek and the surrounding county who were capable and needed work and weren't being given it. She knew this the way she knew most things in the county now, which was through the network of relationships she'd built over the winter through Clara Webb's kitchen table and Hendrick's counter and Tilden's office and the front steps of the courthouse in Hayes City. The first woman she hired was a widow named Ruth Calder, who'd been taking in laundry since her husband died and was precise and hardworking and had the specific gift of making customers feel attended to without making them feel managed. Ruth was skeptical when Evelyn approached her. "I don't know anything about selling," Ruth said. "You know how to talk to people," Evelyn said. "And you know fabric because you've been washing it for 20 years. That's most of what selling is." Ruth looked at her for a moment. "What are you paying?" Evelyn told her. It was more than laundry work paid by a meaningful margin. "When do I start?" Ruth said. The second hire was harder. A girl named Petra, she was 19, the daughter of a German homesteading family east of town, who had been apprenticed to a dressmaker in Hayes City for 2 years and then come back to Red Creek when her mother's health declined. She could sew better than anyone Evelyn had met outside of her own mother, and she had ideas. Real design ideas, the kind that came from genuine visual thinking rather than copying patterns. The hard part was Petra's father, who had opinions about his daughter working in a store on the main street rather than at home. Evelyn went to see him. She sat at the Braun family's kitchen table and drank coffee that was stronger than she preferred and listened to Heinrich Braun explain, in careful English that was his second language, that he didn't doubt Miss Hart's intentions, but that a young woman's reputation was a delicate thing, and he wasn't sure that a commercial establishment on the main street was the appropriate. "Mr. Braun," she said when he paused for breath, "I understand your concern. What I'd like you to consider is this. Your daughter has a skill that is genuinely uncommon. She is better than I am at certain things I've been doing for 15 years. If she doesn't have a place to use that skill professionally, it disappears. She'll spend it on housework and home sewing, and eventually it will just be gone." She looked at him. "That would be a waste of something real, and I think you know that." Heinrich Braun looked at his coffee. "She could work for a woman," his wife, Marta, said from the stove. She said it very quietly, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment. "That's different than working for a man." Heinrich looked at his wife. Something moved between them that Evelyn didn't try to read. 3 days a week, he said finally, to start. Petra was there Monday, Wednesday, and Friday within the week. And by the end of the first month, the 3 days had quietly expanded to 5, without anyone acknowledging the expansion, because Heinrich Braun was a practical man who could see that his daughter came home satisfied, and the money was real. Gideon came to the store on a regular basis that had nothing to do with purchasing goods. He came in the mornings sometimes and drank coffee from the pot Evelyn kept on the small stove in the back room, and they talked about what was happening with the ranch and what was happening with the store and what was happening in the county, which was still working through the aftermath of Hale's conviction in the complicated way that counties do when a dominant power structure has been removed. Hale Land Holdings was being unwound through a court-supervised process. The Henderson family's land had been returned. John Henderson had come back with his wife and the two sons who were still with them, the eldest having built a life somewhere else, and they'd started the work of picking up where they'd left off 3 years prior. Evelyn had gone out to see them and brought a blanket as a housewarming gift, which was a small and inadequate gesture for what it was trying to acknowledge. But Ruth had told her that sometimes small and inadequate gestures were the honest ones. The road contract was rescinded and retendered through proper process, which meant the county road fund went where it was supposed to go. Walter Deering had resigned from the county council. He'd done it quietly and moved his family to a smaller house, and, from what Clara Webb reported, seemed to be living with the specific dignity of a man who has done a shameful thing and is trying to make it right without drama. Evelyn didn't have strong feelings about Deering one way or the other. He'd been weak when it cost him something to be strong, and then he'd been less weak when the ground shifted. People were like that. She was probably like that about something herself, though she hadn't been tested in quite the same way. Old Prewitt had come to the store opening and bought a pair of gloves and walked around the perimeter of the store with the same thoroughness he'd applied to measuring the discrepancy in Gideon's survey line, and then told her it was sound and left. She'd framed that as a review. Lars, the big Swede from Cross Creek Ranch, who'd stood with his arms out while she measured him for the coat, came in periodically for various items and always seemed faintly surprised that the coat still fit, as if he expected his dimensions to have changed since she'd made it. It hadn't, and they hadn't. He continued to say very little and wear the coat everywhere. These were the things that made up the texture of a life beginning to take root in a place. She and Gideon had not talked directly about what existed between them. This was both simpler and more complicated than it sounds. It was simpler because neither of them was young enough to require all the elaborate performance of courtship, and both of them had enough practical common sense to understand that what was between them had been built over months of actual shared difficulty and was therefore more durable than most things. It didn't need to be declared to be real. They both knew it was real. It was more complicated because Evelyn had spent 14 months building a self that was entirely her own, earning her own money, making her own decisions, standing in her own name, and she was not willing to set any of that down. She didn't think Gideon wanted her to. But she'd been in the world long enough to know that what people wanted and what they assumed were not always the same thing, and she needed to understand what he assumed before she could trust the wanting. They talked about it one evening in April, on the porch of Clara Webb's boarding house, where Evelyn still kept a room. Not because she couldn't afford elsewhere, but because she'd come to value Clara's company and the specific warmth of a house where people moved through each other's lives without demanding too much. It was the kind of spring evening that Kansas occasionally produces. Warm, but not yet hot, the sky going through its slow colors, the air smelling of new grass and old wood. They were sitting in the two chairs at the end of the porch, and the conversation had been about the ranch's spring calving numbers. And then it had gone quiet, in the way conversations do when they've arrived somewhere important and are waiting to see who speaks first. Gideon spoke first. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something," he said, "without it coming out wrong." "How long have you been trying?" "About a month?" She looked at the street. "Say it however it comes out. I'll tell you if it's wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to ask you to give up what you've built," he said. "The store is yours. Your name, your work, your decisions. I'm not looking to fold that into something else." He paused. "But I'd like to be more than the man who drinks coffee in your back room." She was quiet for a beat. "What would more look like?" "It would look like whatever we worked out together," he said. "I'm not sure I know exactly. I know I want you around. I know the last 4 months have been different than the 4 months before you drove into town, and the difference is you." He turned and looked at her directly. "I know that when I thought about the theft complaint and what it might cost me, the part that bothered me most wasn't the ranch. It was the possibility of you having less reason to stay." She held his gaze. She thought about the things she'd told herself when she drove into Red Creek. You don't have to like this town. You just have to sell here long enough to move on. She thought about how wrong that had turned out to be. About what it meant to put down roots not because you planned to, but because the ground turned out to be worth staying in. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know, but I'm asking for more than you not going anywhere." "I know you are." She looked at the street again. At the front of Hart Frontier Outfitters, visible from here, The sign she'd had painted plain and clear. The windows with the lights still on inside because Ruth had been working late on a special order and had her own key. The building that had been empty and was not empty anymore. "I need the store to stay mine," she said, "in name and in practice. My accounts, my decisions, my staff." "Yes." "I need you not to have opinions about how I run it unless I ask." "I have opinions about everything," he said, "but I know which ones I'm entitled to and which ones I'm not." She looked at him. "You've thought about this." "For a month," he said. "I told you." She almost smiled. "What does your staff think?" "Abe thinks it's about time. Lars hasn't said anything, but he seems supportive. Tomas has been openly excited about it for 6 weeks, which means I've been obvious longer than I realized." She did smile at that, quietly, looking at her hands. "I'm not easy to live around," she said. "I'm particular about my work, and I carry things in my head, and I don't always explain what I'm thinking until I've thought it through." I noticed. "And I'm not—" She paused. She'd been about to say something about the way she looked, about not being the kind of woman men typically chose when they had choices. She stopped herself. Not because it wasn't something she thought about. She did, in the small hours when the less useful parts of her mind were running. But because she'd looked at the last 4 months and she couldn't find a single moment where Gideon Cross had treated her as anything less than entirely worth his full attention. Whatever she'd expected from men of his position and standing, he hadn't delivered it. "And," he said. "And I'm worth what I'm worth," she said. "I know that. It took me a while to know it, but I know it now." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said simply. "You are." The evening had gone a deeper blue. A lamp came on in the boarding house behind them. Somewhere down the street a door opened and shut. "Ask me properly," she said. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a ring, plain silver, not elaborate, the kind of thing a practical man would choose for a practical woman who he'd understood correctly. He held it without ceremony. "Evelyn Hart," he said, "will you marry me?" It wasn't quite a question the way he said it, more like a statement of intent that was leaving room for her answer. "Yes," she said. "I will." He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which surprised her. "You had it sized," she said. "Clara Webb measured your finger while you were sleeping a month ago," he said. She stared at him. "Clara Webb?" She was very discreet about it. "Clara Webb measured my finger while I was sleeping. I needed to know the size." She looked at the ring on her hand and then looked at him and then started to laugh. Not the polite, managed laugh of social occasions, but the real kind, that comes up from somewhere unexpected and is a little out of control. He watched her laugh with the expression of a man who is very pleased with himself and is willing to let it show. They married in June, in the practical way of people who have a great deal to do and see no reason to make it complicated. Tilden signed the papers. Clara Webb stood with Evelyn. Abe stood with Gideon with the same expression he brought to all occasions, which was thorough and slightly skeptical. Tomas cried, which nobody mentioned and everybody appreciated. Petra made Evelyn's dress, not elaborate, but fitted and well-made in a deep blue wool that Evelyn had been carrying in the store's stock, and Petra had looked at one day and said, "That's yours, you just haven't made it yet." It was the kind of thing Petra said that made Evelyn certain she'd made the right hire. Ruth came and brought a dish she'd made from a recipe she wouldn't share, which was roasted in a way that involved more butter than anyone admitted, and it was very good. Old Prewitt came and sat in the back and didn't speak to anyone much, but he stayed until the end, which was its own kind of statement. John Henderson came with his wife Margaret, and they sat beside the Braun family, Heinrich and Marta and Petra. And at some point in the evening, Evelyn looked across the room at all of them and thought about what it had taken to put these particular people in this particular room together. The blizzard, the rope, the notebook full of threads, the blank countersignature line on a document no one had looked at closely enough. None of it had been what she'd planned when she drove into Red Creek. She'd driven in with a wagon full of winter goods and a plan that extended about 3 weeks forward and not much further. She'd been holding herself together with the specific tight economy of someone who'd lost a great deal and was trying not to lose more. She hadn't been looking for a town to stay in. She hadn't been looking for a fight. She hadn't been looking for a man or a building on the main street or a young woman who sewed better than her, or an 80-year-old neighbor with a memory like Courthouse Archive. She'd been looking for enough sales to get through January. What she'd found instead was the thing she hadn't known she was looking for, which was a place where what she did mattered and what she knew was worth something, and where the people around her were, imperfectly and in their various ways, trying. Hart Frontier Outfitters grew steadily through that first year, and faster through the second. Petra became a partner, not a silent one, not a figurehead, an actual partner with her name in the accounts and a percentage of the profits and opinions about inventory that were usually correct. She brought in a younger sister, Greta, who had different skills. Not sewing, but figures, an instinct for what things cost and what they should sell for that was genuinely valuable. Evelyn paid her accordingly and didn't try to make her into something she wasn't. Ruth's sister-in-law joined them in the second year. Then a woman from the Henderson homestead who'd been doing alterations out of her home and was tired of working in a cold barn. The store became, without Evelyn ever announcing it as such, a place where women who needed work of a particular kind could find it. Not everyone who needed it. She wasn't naive about the limits of one store in one town, but some of them. The work was real and the pay was real, and that was the thing Evelyn had understood from the beginning. Charity wasn't what these women needed. What they needed was the same thing she had needed when she drove into Red Creek. Not generosity, but a fair chance to show what they were worth. She gave them that, and they gave her back work that was better than what she could have done alone, which was the correct outcome, and she said so, plainly, when people commented. Gideon's East Pasture was fully restored to Cross Creek's legal territory by the end of the year. The corrected survey filed with no complications since the Croft Amendment had been officially voided. He ran cattle on it through that fall, and the grass there was as good as everyone had said. The kind of grass that made a rancher quiet in a particular satisfied way when he walked it. He told her about it one evening when she came out to the ranch for dinner. He'd been walking the East Pasture that day with Abe, checking the fence lines, always checking fence lines. That was the ongoing work of a ranch. And he'd stood by the creek in the late afternoon and watched the water run and felt the size of what had almost been taken from him. "I kept thinking about you," he said, "standing in the feed store telling me you'd been paying attention." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't know what to make of you." "Most people didn't," she said. "I knew enough to buy gloves." That was the right instinct. He looked at her across the dinner table. "Are you satisfied?" he asked, "with how it turned out?" She thought about it honestly. The answer was yes, and also more complicated than yes. She was satisfied in the way that comes from having done something real. Not a perfect thing, not a clean thing, but an actual thing that changed actual circumstances for actual people. She'd helped put a man who'd been stealing from this county in front of a judge. She'd helped a family get their land back. She'd built a business that employed women who needed work. She'd found a place where what she knew and what she could do added up to something that meant something. And she'd lost her inventory in a blizzard and nearly frozen her hands off, and been asked to leave by a man who was eventually convicted of extortion and spent the early weeks of her time in Red Creek being ignored and mocked by a town that had already made up its mind about her. So, satisfied, with footnotes. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I expected to be," he said. "When the legal situation was at its worst, I wasn't sure the ranch was worth the fight." He looked at his plate. Then I had someone reminding me why it was. She didn't say anything to that. She picked up her fork and they ate, and the stove crackled, and outside it was a clear spring night, with the stars doing what they do over the Kansas plains, filling the sky from one end to the other in a way that feels overwhelming until you get used to it, and then feels like the only right amount of sky. There's something about a woman who starts over that people misread as stubbornness. What it actually is, and Evelyn understood this about herself by the time she'd been in Red Creek long enough to look back at the woman who'd driven in on that frozen morning. What it actually is a different relationship with the cost of things. When you've already lost what you thought you couldn't survive losing, and you survived it, the calculation changes. The fear is still there. She'd been afraid, plenty, through those winter months. Afraid of the cold and the storm and Victor Hale's flat eyes and the blank counter-signature line on a document that could have gone either way. She hadn't been fearless. She'd been afraid and gone forward anyway, which is the only version of brave that actually works in practice. What she'd learned, what she'd maybe always known but now understood in her bones, was that the people who try to take things from other people count on you being more afraid of losing what you have than they are of being caught. They count on the cost calculation coming out in their favor. They count on you looking at the risk and deciding it's too high. The trick was to stop doing the math on the losing side and start doing it on the other side. What was it worth to fight? What was it worth to pull one thread and then another and then see what came loose? It was worth whatever it cost, because the alternative was what her father had found at the end, the terrible quiet of a man who'd let the calculation be made for him and lost before the fight began. She wasn't her father. She loved him, and she understood him, and she would never say he was wrong for how he faced what happened. But she had his stubbornness without the particular exhaustion that had taken the fight out of him, and she was going to use it as long as she had it. In the fall of her second year in Red Creek, the County Historical Society, which had been recently formed by Clara Webb and 3 other women who felt that certain things ought to be remembered, asked Evelyn to give an account of the Hale investigation for their records. She sat down with Clara and talked for 2 hours about the notebook and the surveys and the threads she'd pulled, and Clara wrote it down in the precise, organized way she brought to all archival work. Toward the end, Clara looked up from her notes. "What made you stay?" she asked. "Really? After the first week, when it was obvious the town wasn't going to welcome you?" Evelyn thought about it. She thought about the farm wife who'd bought the green blanket on the second day, the woman who'd watched Hale's man knock her display into the mud and walked over with the particular set to her jaw that said she'd made a decision. Don't let them run you off. She thought about the boy asleep under a blanket with his mother's arm around him, about John Henderson's receipt book carried for 3 years through the territory by a man who didn't know if it would ever matter, about Prewitt's steady gray-green eyes and his willingness to put his name on a statement against a man who'd controlled the county for 20 years. "People," she said finally. "The people made it worth staying." Clara wrote it down. "And the town?" Clara asked. "Do you feel like it's yours now?" Evelyn looked at the window, at the main street of Red Creek, visible from Clara's sitting room, the boardwalk, the storefronts, the sign on Hart Frontier Outfitters that she could read from here if the light was right, the ordinary business of a place going about its day. "I feel like I earned my place in it," she said. "That's probably enough." Clara looked up from the page. She had the expression of a woman who had been listening carefully and heard something worth noting. "That's more than enough," she said. Evelyn looked at her and thought she was probably right. Outside, the afternoon light was coming through the windows of her store, falling across the things she'd made and the things she'd stocked, and the counter she'd restored from pieces in a cold back room, falling across the work of 2 years that had started with a wagon and a rope and $62.40 and a town that hadn't wanted her. She'd built something here. Not a perfect thing. The store had its slow months and its difficult customers, and the accounts sometimes kept her up at night. The county still had its problems, its injustices, its men in quiet corners doing the math on what they could take if no one looked too closely. She knew that. One conviction and one corrected survey didn't change the nature of the world, but the world in this county, in this town, on this street, was measurably different than it had been. And she was still here. That was the whole of it, really. She stayed and she worked and she paid attention, and that turned out to be enough to change things. It was enough.